Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. The storm hit harder than I expected. I was driving back home after a weekend visit to my parents, and the rain started coming down in sheets. It was almost impossible to see the road. My wipers were going at full speed, but it didn't help much. The wind was howling, making my car sway. I saw a sign for a gas station a few miles ahead and decided to pull over. I needed a break and some shelter until the storm eased up. When I got to the gas station, it looked old and run down. The lights inside were flickering, and the place seemed deserted. I hesitated for a moment but decided to go in. I didn't have much of a choice with the storm raging outside. The bell above the door jingled as I walked in. The inside was just as old and worn as the outside. Shelves were half empty, and the air smelled musty. A man stood behind the counter. He looked to be in his 60s, with gray hair and a friendly smile. "Evening, miss." "Quite a storm out there," he said. "Yeah, it's really bad." "I just need to wait it out for a bit," I replied. "Of course, take your time." "Name's Hank, by the way," he said. "Sarah," I said, forcing a smile. I wandered around the store, pretending to look at the snacks and drinks. I felt uneasy, but I couldn't pinpoint why. "Where are you headed, Sarah?" Hank asked, breaking the silence. "Just on my way home from visiting family," I said. He nodded, his smile never fading. "Not many folks come through here these days. Storm's a real doozy." I nodded and went to the back of the store to find a bathroom. The door was slightly ajar, and the light inside was dim. I pushed the door open and froze. There were chains bolted to the wall, with cuffs hanging from them. The sight made my stomach churn. I backed out slowly, trying not to make any noise. When I got back to the front, Hank was still smiling, but there was something unsettling about it now. "Everything all right?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yeah, just couldn't find the bathroom," I lied. "Right over there," he said, pointing to the door I had just come from. I nodded, pretending I didn't see anything. "Thanks, I'll just wait here until the storm passes." His smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sure thing." I tried to act normal, but my mind was racing. I needed to get out of there. I walked back to the front door, but Hank suddenly moved from behind the counter and blocked my path. "Leaving already?" "Storm's still pretty bad," he said, his tone no longer friendly. I just remembered I have somewhere to be," I stammered. He stepped closer, and I could see a glint of something dangerous in his eyes. "I insist you stay. It's not safe out there." I backed away, my heart pounding. "I really should go." Hank grabbed my arm, his grip strong and painful. I said, "It's not safe." Panic surged through me. I twisted my arm, trying to break free, but his grip tightened. "Let me go!" I shouted. "No need to shout," he said calmly, dragging me towards the back of the store. I struggled, kicking and screaming, but it was no use. He was too strong. He shoved me into a small room and locked the door behind me. The room was dark, with only a small window letting in some light. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but the storm drowned out my cries. I heard Hank's footsteps fading away. I looked around the room, trying to find something, anything to use as a weapon. My eyes fell on an old, rusty pipe lying in the corner. I grabbed it and waited, my heart pounding. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, I heard the door creak open. Hank stepped in, and I swung the pipe with all my strength. It connected with his head, and he stumbled back, cursing. I took my chance and ran. I burst out of the room and headed for the front door. Hank was right behind me, blood trickling down his face. I reached the door and threw it open, the wind and rain hitting me like a wall. I ran to my car, fumbling with my keys. Hank was getting closer, his face twisted with rage. I got the door open and jumped in, locking it behind me. I started the car and floored it, the tires spinning in the mud. Hank banged on the window, but I didn't stop. I drove as fast as I could, the storm making it hard to see. I didn't stop until I reached a town several miles away. I pulled into a well-lit gas station and called the police. They found Hank and arrested him. Turns out, he had a history of kidnapping and had been hiding out at that old gas station for years. I was lucky to get away. Before we continue, I've teamed up with an incredible company called DreamPad that offers fantastic sleep products you might be interested in. One of their standout products is the DreamPad pillow, and let me tell you, it's a game changer for anyone looking to enhance their sleep quality. This pillow isn't your average pillow. It's equipped with innovative technology that delivers soothing sounds directly to your inner ear through gentle vibrations. Picture drifting off to sleep while listening to calming music, nature sounds, or even guided meditations, all without disturbing anyone else around you. Plus, it's available in medium, firm, and even memory foam options, so you don't need headphones or earbuds. Just great sound. And here's the kicker, you can even enjoy all the Horror Hut YouTube videos with the DreamPad pillow as you ease into dreamland. Setting it up is a breeze. Simply connect the pillow to the DreamPad app on your phone, choose your preferred audio, adjust the volume to your liking, and let the relaxation begin. And guess what? I've managed to secure a 15% discount on any of their products exclusively for all my listeners. Just use the code HorrorHut15 at checkout or click the link in the video description below to claim your discount. Give it a shot and let me know how it works for you in the comments. Now, let's get back to the video. It was a stormy night, the kind where the rain pounded on the roof like it was trying to break in, and the wind howled through the trees. I was alone in my farmhouse, nestled in the middle of nowhere. The power had gone out an hour ago, leaving me in the dim glow of candles scattered around the living room. I was reading a book, trying to ignore the creepy sounds outside when I heard it, a knock on the door. My heart skipped a beat. Who could be out here in this weather? I got up slowly, feeling uneasy, and walked to the door. When I opened it, a man stood there, drenched to the bone. He looked harmless enough, but something about him made me nervous. "My car broke down," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Can I come in and use your phone?" I hesitated. Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed through my mind. But I didn't want to be heartless. "Sure," I said, stepping aside to let him in. He thanked me and stepped into the hallway, water dripping from his clothes. I pointed to the phone in the kitchen. "It's over there. Help yourself." He nodded and walked in that direction, and I followed him, trying to shake off the bad feeling in my gut. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. As he talked, I noticed him glancing around, taking in the details of my house. "Thanks for letting me in," he said, hanging up the phone. "My name's David, by the way." "Emma," I replied, still feeling uneasy. "Did you get through to someone?" "Yeah, my friend will be here in about an hour," he said. "Mind if I wait here?" I didn't like the idea, but what choice did I have? "Sure, make yourself comfortable," I said, trying to sound more at ease than I felt. He sat on the couch, and I offered him a towel, which he accepted gratefully. We made small talk for a bit. He seemed normal enough, but then he started saying things that set off alarm bells. "You've got a really nice place here," he said, looking around. "I've always liked old farmhouses like this. Your family must have had it for generations." My blood ran cold. How did he know that? "Yeah," I said cautiously. "It was my grandparents." He nodded, like he already knew. "I bet it has some interesting stories," he said, his eyes locking onto mine in a way that made me feel like he could see right through me. I forced a smile. "Yeah, it does. But it's just me here now." David's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That must get lonely sometimes." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Not really," I lied. "I like the peace and quiet." He leaned back, seeming too comfortable. "You must be really brave, living out here all alone." The way he said it made my skin crawl. I stood up, needing to put some distance between us. "Can I get you something to drink?" "Coffee, tea?" "Coffee would be great," he said, his eyes following me as I moved to the kitchen. I started the coffee maker, my mind racing. I needed to get him out of here. When I turned back, he was standing in the doorway, watching me. "You've got a lot of family photos," he said, nodding toward the hallway where the pictures hung. "Yeah," I said, my voice tight. "Lots of memories." He stepped closer, and I fought the urge to back away. "It's funny," he said softly. "I feel like I know this place. Like I've been here before." My heart was pounding now. "Maybe you drove by sometime," I said, trying to sound casual. "Maybe," he said, but his smile told me he didn't believe it. "Or maybe it's just so welcoming." I forced a laugh. "Yeah, I guess so." The coffee finished brewing, and I poured him a cup, my hand shaking slightly. As I handed it to him, he grabbed my wrist. "Thanks, Emma," he said, his grip tightening. "You're really kind." I pulled my hand away, my heart racing. "You're welcome," I said, stepping back. "Your friend should be here soon." He took a sip of the coffee, his eyes never leaving mine. "I hope so," he said. "I wouldn't want to overstay my welcome." I smiled, but inside I was panicking. I needed to get him out of here. "You know, the storm's letting up," I said. "Maybe you should wait outside, so you don't miss your friend." He didn't move. "It's still pretty rough out there," he said. "I'm sure you don't mind me staying a bit longer." I was running out of options. "Actually, I do," I said, trying to sound firm. "I'm really tired and need to get some sleep." He put down the coffee cup and stood up, his smile gone. "That's too bad," he said, his voice low. "I was hoping we could get to know each other better." Fear shot through me. "Please, just go," I said, my voice shaking. He took a step toward me, and I backed up until I hit the counter. "Emma, don't be like that," he said, his eyes cold. "We were just starting to have fun." I grabbed a knife from the counter, holding it between us. "Get out," I said, my voice steady now. He raised his hands, smirking. Okay. No need for that." He backed away slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. I followed him to the door, the knife still in my hand. "Go," I said again. He opened the door and stepped outside, the rain still pouring down. "I'll be seeing you, Emma," he said, his voice a chilling promise. I slammed the door and locked it, my hands trembling. I watched through the window as he walked away, disappearing into the night. I didn't sleep at all that night, too afraid he might come back. When morning finally came, I called the police and told them everything. They promised to keep an eye on the area, but I knew I wouldn't feel safe for a long time. That night changed everything. I wasn't just a farmer living in a quiet old house anymore. I was a survivor, and I would never let my guard down again. Working the late-night shift at the radio station had always been a bit eerie, but I loved the solitude. My name's Rick, and I've been a DJ for the past 5 years. Most nights, it was just me, the soundboard, and the occasional caller. I liked the calm and the chance to play whatever I wanted. One night, around 1 a.m., I got a call that changed everything. The phone rang, and I answered it as usual. The voice on the other end was low and rough. The guy didn't say much at first, just that he was a listener. He sounded strange, but I didn't think much of it. "Play something for me, Rick," he said. I asked what he wanted to hear. "Surprise me," he replied, and then hung up. I shrugged it off and played a random track. About 15 minutes later, the phone rang again. It was the same guy. "You've got good taste, Rick," he said. His voice made my skin crawl. "What else can you play for me?" I tried to engage him, but he kept his answers short, almost like he didn't want to talk, just listen. Then he hung up again. I started feeling uneasy, but it wasn't uncommon to get weird calls during the night shift. I shook it off and continued with my playlist. Around 2 a.m., the phone rang again. This time, he was more talkative. "I like your show, Rick," he said. "I can see why people listen to you." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. It felt like he was watching me. I laughed it off, asking him how he could see me through the radio. He didn't laugh. Instead, he said, "You should be careful, Rick. You never know who's out there." I felt my pulse quicken. I tried to get him to reveal more about himself, but he hung up again. I looked around the small studio, suddenly hyper-aware of the darkness outside the windows. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was just a prank. Half an hour later, he called again. This time, he was angry. "You didn't play the song I wanted," he growled. I reminded him that he hadn't requested anything specific. He was silent for a moment, then said, "I'm closer than you think, Rick. I'm watching." My heart was pounding now. I stood up and locked the studio door, checking the windows again. They were dark, the parking lot outside dimly lit by a single street lamp. I tried to shake off the fear and keep the show going, but my hands were trembling. The next call came just after 3 a.m. He was calm again, almost too calm. "I'm outside, Rick. Why don't you come out and see me?" My throat went dry. I didn't respond, just hung up the phone and called the police. They said they'd send a car to check the area. I stayed on the air, trying to act normal, but my mind was racing. I couldn't stop thinking about the caller. Was he really outside, or was he just messing with me? I decided to take a look. I turned off the mic and walked over to the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Then, under the street lamp, I saw a figure. He was just standing there, looking up at the building. I couldn't see his face, but I knew it was him. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I backed away from the window, feeling a surge of panic. The phone rang again, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I didn't want to answer, but I had to. I picked it up with a shaking hand. "Did you see me, Rick?" His voice was almost gleeful. "I see you." I slammed the phone down and backed into the corner of the studio, feeling trapped. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. I kept glancing at the clock, willing the police to arrive. Finally, I saw the flashing red and blue lights outside. The figure under the street lamp disappeared into the shadows. I ran to the door and unlocked it, practically throwing myself outside as the officers approached. I explained everything to them, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. They searched the area but found nothing. The figure was gone. They told me to stay inside and lock the doors, that they'd keep a car outside for the rest of my shift. I went back to the studio, but I couldn't focus. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and anxiety. I kept expecting the phone to ring, but it stayed silent. When my shift finally ended, I practically ran to my car, the police following me home to make sure I was safe. I didn't sleep that day, or the next. The fear stayed with me, the memory of that voice and the figure under the street lamp haunting my thoughts. I took a few days off, hoping the distance would help, but the paranoia lingered. When I finally went back to work, the fear hadn't left. Every ring of the phone made my heart race. Every shadow outside the window made me jump. I don't know if he'll ever come back, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting. I worked the night shift at the hospital as an intern. It wasn't the best hours, but it's what I got. The ER was usually hectic, but that one week was particularly busy. People coming in, people going out. Amidst all the chaos, one patient caught my eye. He was an older man, mid-50s, with graying hair and a tired look. He was admitted for a minor injury and was supposed to be discharged a few days ago. On my second night, I saw him in the hallway again. I thought maybe his discharge got delayed, but I didn't think much of it. The next night, I saw him again, but this time he was in a different room, wearing a different hospital gown. He looked at me and quickly turned away. It struck me as odd, but I was too busy to dwell on it. By the fourth night, I was sure something was off. I saw him in the cafeteria, then later in the waiting area, each time in different clothes. He avoided eye contact and seemed nervous. I decided to check his chart to see why he was still around. But when I looked up his name, it said he had been discharged 3 days ago. My stomach churned with unease. I went to talk to one of the nurses, but she shrugged it off, saying sometimes patients linger for a bit before they leave, especially if they don't have anywhere to go. But this felt different. He wasn't just hanging around, he was hiding in plain sight. The next night, I decided to keep an eye on him. Around midnight, I saw him slipping into an empty room. I followed, keeping my distance. He didn't notice me. Inside the room, he rummaged through the drawers and then moved to the closet, pulling out a set of scrubs. My heart pounded as I watched him change into the scrubs and slip out of the room. I knew I needed to tell someone, but I wasn't sure who would believe me. I decided to talk to Dr. Miller, one of the senior doctors who was always around during the night shift. I found him in his office and told him everything. He looked at me skeptically but agreed to check it out. We walked back to the hallway where I had last seen the man. He was gone. We searched the nearby rooms but found nothing. Dr. Miller gave me a stern look and told me to focus on my work, implying that maybe I was just tired and seeing things. I couldn't let it go. The next night, I brought my own camera to work, a small one that I could easily hide. Around midnight, I saw him again, this time heading towards the surgical wing. I followed quietly, my heart racing. He stopped at a storage room and slipped inside. I waited a moment before creeping up and peeking through the small window. He was inside, changing clothes again. This time, he was putting on a janitor's uniform. I took a few pictures and then hurried back to the ER, my mind racing. I needed proof, and now I had it. I went back to Dr. Miller and showed him the pictures. His eyes widened, and he finally believed me. We called security and showed them the pictures. They started a search, and within an hour, they found the man hiding in one of the supply closets. He had a bag with various IDs and hospital badges. It turned out he was a former patient with a history of mental illness. He had been sneaking around, posing as different people to avoid detection. He wasn't dangerous, just scared and confused. The police took him away, and I finally felt a sense of relief. The hospital tightened security after that, making sure something like this wouldn't happen again. I went back to my usual routine, but the memory of that week stayed with me. I still think about him sometimes, wondering what drove him to do what he did. The hospital can be a place of healing, but it can also be a place of shadows and secrets. Working the night shift, you see things that others don't. And sometimes, those things are more terrifying than you can imagine. The storm hit us hard about an hour into the ferry ride. The sky turned dark, and the waves started tossing the boat around like a toy. I was on the upper deck, trying to keep my balance while watching the water crash against the sides. It was supposed to be a routine trip across the bay, but this storm came out of nowhere. I decided to go inside and find a seat. The cabin was crowded with people trying to escape the weather. I found an empty spot near the back and sat down, wiping the rain off my face. The air was thick with the smell of wet clothes and anxiety. Everyone was nervous, and the storm wasn't helping. I noticed a man sitting across from me. He was wearing a dark coat and a hat pulled low over his eyes. Something about him seemed off. He kept glancing around, fidgeting with a small black bag on his lap. Every few minutes, he'd look at his watch and then back at the bag. It made me uneasy. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid because of the storm. But I couldn't stop watching him. He looked around again, and this time our eyes met. He quickly looked away, stuffing the bag under his seat. That's when I knew something wasn't right. I got up and moved closer, pretending to stretch my legs. From my new spot, I could see the bag better. It was partially open, and I caught a glimpse of wires and a small device inside. My heart started pounding. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I decided to find a crew member. I walked towards the front of the cabin, trying to act casual. I spotted a crew member near the entrance, talking to a couple of passengers. I waited until he was alone, then approached him. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice low. "I need to talk to you. It's important." He looked at me, eyebrows raised. "What's the matter?" "There's a man back there," I said, nodding towards the back of the cabin. "He has a bag with some kind of device in it. It looks dangerous." The crew member's expression changed. He glanced towards the back, then back at me. "Stay here," he said. "I'll take care of it." He walked away quickly, and I watched as he approached the man. The man saw him coming and grabbed the bag, standing up. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the man was shaking his head, trying to walk away. The crew member blocked his path, and that's when the man shoved him and started running. Panic erupted in the cabin. People were screaming and trying to get out of the way. I followed the man, pushing through the crowd. He ran down a narrow corridor, heading towards the lower deck. I didn't know what I was doing, but I couldn't let him get away. I caught up to him just as he reached the stairs. He turned and saw me, his eyes wide with fear and anger. He reached into the bag, and I saw the glint of a knife. I backed up, holding my hands up. "Stay back," he said, his voice shaking. "Just stay back." I didn't move. He turned and ran down the stairs, and I followed at a distance. The lower deck was mostly empty, and the sound of the storm was louder down here. I saw him disappear into a storage room, and I knew I had to act fast. I looked around and saw a fire extinguisher on the wall. I grabbed it and crept towards the storage room. I could hear him inside, rummaging through the bag. I took a deep breath and swung the door open, spraying the extinguisher at him. He shouted and dropped the bag, trying to shield himself. I charged at him, hitting him with the extinguisher. He fell to the ground, and I grabbed the bag, running out of the room. I didn't stop until I reached the upper deck, where I found the crew member I had talked to earlier. He took the bag from me and called for backup. Within minutes, more crew members arrived and restrained the man. They searched the bag and found a homemade explosive device. The police were called, and they took the man into custody when we reached the shore. The rest of the trip was a blur. I was shaken, but relieved that it was over. The crew thanked me for my help, and I was given a voucher for a free trip as a reward. But I knew I wouldn't be taking any more ferries for a long time. The memory of that man's eyes, the fear and anger in them, still haunts me. I'm just glad I trusted my instincts and acted before it was too late. I was driving home from campus late one evening, eager to get back to my dorm and unwind after a long day of classes. The quickest route was through a wooded area, a shortcut I often took to save time. But little did I know, that decision would lead me straight into a nightmare. As I drove deeper into the forest, the trees closed in around me, casting eerie shadows across the road. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me like a heavy blanket, but I pushed it aside, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then, up ahead, I saw them, a group of figures standing in the middle of the road, their faces obscured by dark masks. My heart leaped into my throat as I slammed on the brakes, bringing my car to a screeching halt just a few feet away from the menacing figures. I sat frozen in my seat, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I stared at the masked individuals blocking my path. I could feel their eyes on me, boring into my soul with a chilling intensity that sent shivers down my spine. For a moment, we just stared at each other, locked in a tense standoff as the silence stretched on. And then, without warning, one of the figures stepped forward, a glint of menace in their eyes as they approached my car. I knew I had to get out of there, to escape before things took a turn for the worse. With trembling hands, I fumbled for the keys in the ignition, my heart pounding in my chest as I prayed for the engine to turn over. But as I tried to start the car, I realized with horror that it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as I frantically pumped the gas pedal, willing the engine to come to life, but it was no use. My car was dead, a useless hunk of metal in the face of danger. I was trapped, at the mercy of the masked figures who now surrounded my car, their presence looming over me like a dark cloud. I could hear them whispering to each other in hushed tones, their voices low and menacing as they discussed their next move. I knew I had to think fast, to come up with a plan to escape before it was too late. With shaking hands, I reached for my phone, my fingers fumbling with the buttons as I tried to dial for help. But as I glanced down at the screen, I realized with a sinking feeling that there was no signal. We were too far off the beaten path, too deep in the heart of the forest for my phone to reach anyone. Desperation clawed at me as I searched for a way out, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. And then, suddenly, a voice broke through the silence, cutting through the darkness like a knife. It was one of the masked figures, their voice low and gravelly as they spoke to me through the closed window of my car. They demanded that I hand over my belongings, threatening me with violence if I refused. I felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through me as I realized the gravity of the situation. These people weren't just here to scare me, they were dangerous, and they meant business. But even as fear threatened to overwhelm me, a steely resolve settled over me like a protective shield. I may have been trapped, but I refused to go down without a fight. With trembling hands, I reached for my bag, fumbling for my wallet and phone as I prepared to comply with their demands. But even as I handed over my belongings, I knew that this was far from over. As the masked figures disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone in the silence of the forest, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settle over me like a heavy weight. I knew that I had narrowly escaped a terrifying encounter, but the memory of that night would haunt me for years to come. But despite the fear and uncertainty that lingered in the air, I was grateful to be alive. And as I drove away from that dark forest, I made a promise to myself: I would never take shortcuts again, no matter how tempting they may seem. I was stuck at the train station during one of the worst storms I had ever seen. The rain was pounding against the windows, and the wind howled like a wild animal. I had missed my train home, and the next one wasn't due for hours. The station was almost empty, just me and a few other unlucky souls stranded by the weather. I sat on a cold, metal bench, watching the rain. The lights flickered occasionally, making the shadows in the corners dance. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and tried to get comfortable, but the bench was hard, and the air was damp and chilly. After a while, I noticed a man walking towards me. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark uniform. I assumed he was a security guard, though I hadn't seen him before. He had a badge clipped to his chest and a flashlight in his hand. "Evening," he said, his voice deep and slightly raspy. "You waiting for the next train?" "Yeah," I replied. "Got stuck here because of the storm." "Bad one, isn't it?" He glanced at the windows, the rain still hammering down. "Name's Carl. I'm the night security here." "I'm Laura," I said. "Nice to meet you." He nodded and sat down on the bench across from me. His presence was a bit unsettling, but I figured he was just doing his job. We sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the storm. "Not many people here tonight," he said finally, looking around the empty station. "Most folks cleared out before it got this bad." "Yeah, it's pretty deserted," I agreed. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. "So, Laura, where you headed?" "Home," I said. "Just trying to get home." He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving my face. "You know, it's not safe for a young woman to be alone in a place like this. Lots of strange people around." I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about the way he said it made me uneasy. "I'm fine," I said quickly. "Just waiting for my train." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, if you need anything, I'll be around." He stood up and walked away, his boots echoing on the tiled floor. I watched him disappear into the shadows, feeling a sense of relief once he was gone. But the relief didn't last long. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. I tried to distract myself by reading a book, but I couldn't focus. Every time the lights flickered, I glanced around, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me. The minutes dragged on, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to stretch my legs. I walked down the platform, trying to shake off the unease. As I passed a row of lockers, I heard a noise behind me. I turned quickly, but no one was there. Just the empty station and the sound of the storm. I told myself I was being paranoid. There was no reason to be scared. But as I turned to head back to my bench, I saw him again. Carl, standing at the far end of the platform, watching me. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were dark and intense. I forced a smile and nodded at him, hoping to appear calm. He didn't respond, just kept staring. I hurried back to my seat, my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. I needed to find a way out of there, but with the storm raging outside, I had nowhere to go. I decided to go to the restroom, hoping to buy some time and gather my thoughts. The restroom was down a dimly lit hallway, and as I walked, I felt like I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing. Inside the restroom, I splashed some water on my face and took a deep breath. I needed to stay calm and think clearly. But when I stepped out, Carl was there, leaning against the wall. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice dripping with false concern. "Yeah, just needed a break," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He took a step closer, and I could see the cold glint in his eyes. "You know, the storm's getting worse. Might be a good idea to find somewhere safer to wait." "I'm fine here," I insisted, backing away. His smile faded, replaced by a hard, menacing look. "I don't think you understand. It's not safe here." My heart was racing now. I needed to get away from him. "I'll take my chances," I said, turning to leave. He grabbed my arm, his grip tight and painful. "I'm not giving you a choice," he growled. I yanked my arm free and ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty station. I could hear him behind me, his boots pounding on the floor. I didn't know where to go, but I had to get away. I darted down a hallway and into a storage room, slamming the door shut behind me. I looked around, my eyes searching for something to block the door. I spotted a heavy shelf and pushed it against the door, my hands shaking. I could hear Carl outside, trying the handle and then pounding on the door. "Let me in, Laura," he shouted. "You're only making this harder on yourself." I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I needed to find a way to call for help. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. The storm had knocked out the cell towers. I was trapped. I heard a crash outside and realized he was trying to break down the door. I had to think fast. I looked around the room and spotted a small window near the ceiling. It was a tight fit, but it was my only chance. I climbed up on a stack of boxes and pushed the window open. The rain and wind hit me immediately, but I didn't care. I squeezed through the window, cutting my hands on the glass, and dropped down onto the wet pavement outside. I could hear Carl shouting behind me, but I didn't stop. I ran through the storm, my clothes soaked and my heart pounding. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away from him. I finally saw the lights of a nearby building and ran towards it. It was a small diner, and the sight of it filled me with relief. I burst through the door, gasping for breath. The few people inside turned to look at me, their faces filled with concern. "Help," I managed to say. "There's a man. He's after me." The staff quickly called the police, and they arrived within minutes. I told them everything, and they assured me I was safe now. They found Carl still trying to break into the storage room, and he was arrested. The ordeal left me shaken, but I was grateful to be alive. I never thought a simple trip could turn into a nightmare, but it did. I'll never forget the look in Carl's eyes, the fear and anger. It's something that will haunt me forever. I had been working the graveyard shift at the diner for about 6 months. The hours were long and the pay wasn't great, but it was a job. The place was usually quiet at night, mostly truckers and night owls stopping by for a quick meal. I liked the solitude and the routine. It was a Tuesday night, around 2 a.m., when a group of 5 men walked in. They were loud, laughing and talking in hushed tones that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. They looked out of place, dressed too nicely for our little diner. I put on my best smile and walked over to their table with a notepad. "Evening, gentlemen. What can I get for you?" I asked. They barely glanced at the menu. "Coffee, and keep it coming," one of them said. His voice was sharp, commanding. The others nodded in agreement. I poured their coffee and went back to the counter, keeping an eye on them. They seemed restless, looking around the diner as if expecting someone. The atmosphere felt tense, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the night wore on, they started to get more aggressive. They laughed louder, made crude jokes, and began harassing the other customers. A couple at a nearby table tried to ignore them, but the men wouldn't leave them alone. One of the men, the one who had ordered the coffee, got up and walked over to the couple. "You two having a nice night?" he asked, his tone mocking. The couple looked uncomfortable, and the man put his arm around the woman, pulling her closer. I knew I had to do something. I walked over and tried to intervene. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave them alone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned to me, a cold smile on his face. "Or what?" he asked, taking a step closer. I could smell the alcohol on his breath. "Or I'll call the police," I said, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. He laughed. "Go ahead. I'd love to see them try and do something about it." The other men at the table laughed too, egging him on. I backed away, my heart pounding. I went to the counter and picked up the phone, dialing 911. As the phone rang, I saw one of the men stand up and walk towards me. I turned away, hoping the police would answer quickly. 911, what's your emergency?" the operator said. I spoke quickly, trying to keep my voice low. "I'm at the diner on Route 5. There's a group of men here harassing customers. I need help." The man was getting closer. I turned to face him, holding the phone tightly. "Put the phone down," he said, his voice cold. I did as he said, my hands shaking. The operator was still on the line, but I couldn't speak. The man leaned over the counter, his face inches from mine. "You're making a big mistake," he said. I nodded, trying to keep my composure. He stared at me for a moment, then turned and walked back to his table. I picked up the phone again, whispering to the operator, "Please hurry." The men continued their harassment, and I tried to keep the other customers calm. The couple eventually left, clearly frightened. It was just me and the group of men now. One of them got up and walked over to the jukebox, putting on some loud, thumping music. They started to dance, their movements erratic and wild. I stood behind the counter, watching them and praying the police would arrive soon. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the flashing lights of a police car outside. The men didn't seem to notice. I ran to the door and waved the officers in. They walked in, and the mood in the diner shifted instantly. The men stopped dancing and turned to face the officers. "Is there a problem here?" one of the officers asked. The man who had threatened me earlier stepped forward. "No problem, officer. We're just having a good time." The officer looked at me, and I nodded slightly, letting him know that wasn't true. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the officer said. The men grumbled but didn't argue. They slowly made their way out of the diner, throwing dirty looks over their shoulders. As soon as they were gone, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The officers stayed for a while, making sure everything was okay. I thanked them profusely, my hands still shaking. They told me to call if anything like that ever happened again and left. I sat down at the counter, trying to calm my nerves. The diner was quiet again, but the tension lingered in the air. I stayed on edge for the rest of my shift, jumping at every little noise. The night dragged on, and I couldn't wait for the morning to come. When my replacement finally arrived, I was exhausted but relieved. I told her what had happened, and she gave me a sympathetic look. "You did the right thing," she said. "I'm glad you're okay." I nodded, still feeling uneasy. As I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about the men and how quickly things had escalated. I hoped I'd never have to deal with something like that again. The quiet of the night shift was no longer comforting. It was a reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. When I got home, I collapsed into bed, too tired to even eat. I lay there in the dark, replaying the events of the night in my mind. I knew I'd never forget the look in that man's eyes or the way my heart had pounded in my chest. The graveyard shift would never feel the same again. Working the night shift at the manufacturing plant was always quiet. The machines hummed steadily, and the fluorescent lights buzzed softly. I liked the calmness of it, the routine. My name is Laura, and I had been working there for 5 years. It was a job that didn't change much, and I appreciated that. One night, things felt different. I noticed Jim, one of my coworkers, acting strangely. Jim was a bit older, usually kept to himself, but he always did his job without any issues. That night, he seemed distracted, nervous even. He kept glancing around, like he was waiting for something. During our scheduled break, I saw Jim head toward the maintenance area instead of the break room. It struck me as odd because Jim never missed his breaks. I decided to follow him, keeping a good distance so he wouldn't notice me. I watched as he slipped into the maintenance room, looking around before closing the door behind him. My curiosity got the better of me, so I quietly walked over and peeked through the small window in the door. What I saw made my heart race. Jim was tampering with the main control panel. He had a set of tools laid out and was making adjustments to the machinery. I didn't know much about the technical side of things, but it was clear he was doing something he shouldn't be. The look on his face was intense, focused, but there was a hint of panic too. I stepped back from the door, unsure of what to do. I knew I had to tell someone, but the night shift supervisor, Mike, was out on a delivery run. The only other person I could turn to was Karen, but she was working on the other side of the plant. I decided to confront Jim myself, hoping it was all a misunderstanding. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and walked in. "Jim, what are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He jumped, nearly dropping his tools. "Laura, you shouldn't be here," he said, his voice shaking. "Neither should you," I replied. "What's going on?" He stared at me for a moment, then sighed. "I didn't want anyone to find out," he said. "But you have to understand, I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I'm just trying to make a point." "A point? By messing with the machinery?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Management isn't listening to us," he said. "We've been reporting safety issues for months, but they don't care. I thought if I could create a small incident, they'd finally take us seriously." My mind was racing. I understood his frustration, but this wasn't the way to handle it. "Jim, this is dangerous. You could hurt a lot of people." He looked desperate. "I know, but I'm not planning anything big. Just enough to get their attention. I needed to defuse the situation. Let's just talk to Mike when he gets back. Maybe there's another way." Jim shook his head. "It's too late, Laura. I've already made the changes." My heart sank. "What did you do?" "I adjusted the pressure settings on the main line. It'll cause a minor leak, nothing catastrophic, but enough to force them to shut down production and fix the problem." I didn't know what to say. I had to stop this. Jim, you need to undo whatever you did. Now, before it's too late. He hesitated, then nodded. Okay. I'll fix it. Just keep an eye out for anyone coming. I watched as he hurriedly worked to reverse the changes he'd made. My hands were shaking, and I kept glancing at the door, expecting someone to walk in at any moment. After what felt like forever, Jim finally stepped back from the panel, wiping sweat from his forehead. "It's done," he said. "Everything's back to normal." I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. "We need to report this," I said. "You can't just walk away from this." Jim nodded, defeated. "I know. I'll face the consequences." We both headed back to the main floor. I kept an eye on Jim to make sure he didn't try anything else. When Mike returned, we told him everything. He was shocked, but he handled it professionally, immediately shutting down the plant and calling in the higher-ups. Jim was suspended and faced disciplinary action. It was a tense few days as the investigation unfolded. In the end, Jim's actions did bring attention to the safety concerns, but not in the way he had hoped. The management started taking our reports more seriously, implementing new safety protocols. It was a relief to know that things would improve, but the whole incident left me shaken. I never expected something like this to happen on my quiet night shifts. Now, every time I walk past the maintenance room, I think about that night and how close we came to disaster. I was driving through the storm, the rain pounding against the windshield, making it hard to see. The wipers were working overtime, but visibility was still terrible. I was on my way to visit my parents for the weekend, but the weather had other plans. After hours of fighting the elements, I decided to pull over and find a place to stay for the night. I spotted a small, rundown motel on the side of the road. The neon sign flickered, but it was a beacon of hope in the middle of the storm. I pulled into the parking lot, relieved to be off the road. The lot was nearly empty, with just a couple of other cars parked haphazardly. I grabbed my bag and hurried inside, the rain soaking me to the bone in the few steps it took to reach the door. The lobby was dimly lit, with old, worn-out furniture and a musty smell. The man behind the counter looked up as I entered, a broad smile spreading across his face. "Welcome. Need a room for the night?" he asked, his voice overly cheerful for the late hour. "Yes, please," I replied, shivering from the cold and the wet clothes clinging to my skin. "You're in luck. We have plenty of vacancies." "I'll get you set up in one of our best rooms," he said, grabbing a key from the wall behind him. He handed me the key with a number on it and pointed me down the hallway. "Room 12, just down that way. If you need anything, don't hesitate to call the front desk." I thanked him and made my way to the room, feeling a bit uneasy but too tired to care. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was small but clean, with a bed, a dresser, and a small TV mounted on the wall. I dropped my bag on the bed and went into the bathroom to change out of my wet clothes. After changing into something dry, I felt a bit better. I turned on the TV, hoping to find some news about the storm, but the reception was terrible. The screen flickered with static, and I could barely make out any images. Frustrated, I turned it off and decided to get some sleep. I climbed into bed and pulled the covers up, trying to ignore the feeling of unease that had settled in my stomach. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard a faint clicking sound. It was so quiet that I almost thought I imagined it, but then it came again. I sat up, listening intently. The sound was coming from the corner of the room. I got out of bed and walked over to the dresser, where the sound seemed to be coming from. I opened the drawers, but they were empty. I was about to give up when I noticed something strange behind the TV. There was a small, black device mounted on the wall, almost hidden from view. I reached up and pulled it off, realizing it was a camera. My heart started pounding as I looked around the room, spotting another camera in the corner near the ceiling. Panic set in as I realized I was being watched. I quickly grabbed my bag and headed for the door, but as I reached for the handle, it turned from the other side. The manager stood there, his smile now gone, replaced with a look of cold calculation. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. I forced a smile, trying to hide my fear. Actually, I was just about to come to the front desk. "I think there's a problem with the room." He stepped inside, blocking the door. "What kind of problem?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. I took a step back, my mind racing. I found something. "I think there's a camera in here." His expression didn't change. "Oh, that. It's just for security, you know. To make sure our guests are safe." I didn't believe him for a second. "I'd like to check out, please. I don't feel comfortable staying here." He shook his head slowly. "I'm afraid I can't let you leave. Not until the storm passes." I knew I had to get out of there. I glanced around the room, looking for something to use as a weapon. My eyes landed on the lamp on the nightstand. Without thinking, I grabbed it and swung it at him. The lamp shattered against his head, and he stumbled back, giving me just enough time to slip past him and run down the hallway. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I burst through the front door and ran to my car, fumbling with the keys in my panic. I finally got the door open and jumped in, locking it behind me. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and sped out of the parking lot, the rain still pouring down. I drove for miles, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that motel. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. I couldn't believe I had been so close to danger. Eventually, I found another motel, one that looked much safer, and checked in. That night, I barely slept, the fear and adrenaline keeping me on edge. The next morning, I reported the incident to the police, but I never heard back about what happened to the manager. I learned to trust my instincts that night, and I never let my guard down again. I decided to spend a few days at my family's beach house. I wanted some time alone, away from the chaos of the city. The weather forecast said there'd be a storm, but I didn't mind. I liked the sound of rain and waves crashing. It felt peaceful. The first night, the wind started picking up. By the time I went to bed, the rain was hitting the windows hard. I could hear the ocean roaring. I pulled the covers up and tried to sleep, but the storm kept me awake. Around midnight, I heard a loud crash outside. I got up and looked out the window. Through the sheets of rain, I saw a small boat had washed ashore. 2 men were stumbling out of it. They looked soaked and desperate. I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me wanted to help, but another part was cautious. I decided to go downstairs and see what was happening. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the back door. The wind almost knocked me over. The men saw my light and started waving. "Please, we need help," one of them shouted. I couldn't hear him well over the storm, but his voice sounded desperate. I waved them over. They ran to the house, shivering and soaked. I let them in and shut the door behind them. "Thank you," one of them said, catching his breath. "Our boat got caught in the storm." "Do you have a phone we can use?" the other man asked. No service out here, I said. But you can dry off and warm up inside. They nodded, looking around the house. Something about their gaze made me uneasy, but I tried to shake it off. I got them some towels and let them dry off by the fireplace. As they warmed up, I asked them what happened. We were out fishing, the first man said. Got caught in the storm and couldn't make it back. Yeah, the other man added, then our boat hit something and started sinking. We barely made it to shore. I nodded, but something felt off. Their story seemed too simple. They were looking around the house too much, like they were casing the place. What's your name? I asked, trying to keep things calm. I'm Mike, and this is Jeff, the first man said. I'm Chris, I replied. You're welcome to stay until the storm passes. They thanked me again, but the tension was thick. I offered them some dry clothes and food. As they changed, I noticed they both had tattoos that looked like prison ink. My unease grew. We sat in the living room, the storm raging outside. I tried to make small talk, but they were evasive. They kept glancing at each other, like they were silently communicating. I excused myself to go to the bathroom. I needed to think. Something wasn't right. I decided to call the local police station. There was a landline in the house, and I hoped it still worked. As I dialed, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Mike standing in the doorway, watching me. What are you doing? He asked, his tone cold. Just checking on something, I lied, hanging up the phone. Mike's eyes narrowed. You're not calling anyone, are you? No, I said quickly. Just checking if the phone works. He didn't look convinced but stepped back. I knew I had to be careful. I went back to the living room, trying to act normal. Jeff was looking through the kitchen cabinets. Got any booze? He asked. No, sorry, I said. Just water and soda. He grunted, clearly annoyed. The atmosphere was getting worse. I could feel their hostility growing. The storm outside was relentless. It felt like it would never end. I needed to find a way to get these guys out of my house. I decided to try and reason with them. Look, I said, trying to sound calm. You're welcome to stay until the storm passes, but I need to know you're not going to cause any trouble. Mike and Jeff exchanged glances again. Mike smirked. We're not here to cause trouble. Just needed a place to stay. His tone was sarcastic, almost mocking. I didn't believe him. I needed a plan. I decided to try and get them to leave voluntarily. If you're not comfortable here, there's a small town a few miles down the road, I said. They might have a place you can stay. Jeff laughed. You really think we're going out in this storm? I felt trapped. The tension was thick, and I knew I had to be careful. I decided to try and keep them distracted until the storm passed. I suggested we play a game to pass the time. They agreed, but their interest seemed fake. As we played, I kept thinking about how to get out of this situation. I needed to stay alert and ready to act if things went south. The hours dragged on, the storm showing no signs of letting up. Suddenly, Mike stood up. I need to check something outside. I felt a surge of panic. What do you need to check? Just something with the boat, he said, heading for the door. I knew I couldn't let him go alone. I'll come with you, I said. He turned, a cold look in his eyes. No need. Stay here. I followed him anyway, grabbing my flashlight. As we stepped outside, the wind almost knocked us over. I could barely see through the rain, but I followed Mike to the boat. When we reached it, he turned to me. Why are you really out here? I told you, I wanted to help, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He stepped closer, his expression menacing. I don't believe you. Before I could react, he lunged at me. I dodged, the flashlight slipping from my hand. We grappled in the mud, the storm raging around us. I managed to push him off and ran back to the house, slamming the door behind me. Jeff was waiting inside, his expression cold. Where's Mike? He's staying with the boat, I lied, trying to catch my breath. Jeff didn't look convinced. You're hiding something. I needed to act fast. We should wait for the storm to pass, then you can both leave. Jeff's eyes narrowed. We're not going anywhere. I knew I had to get help. I moved towards the phone, but Jeff blocked my way. You're not calling anyone, he said, his voice low and threatening. I felt a surge of fear. These men were dangerous, and I was trapped. I needed a plan. I decided to try and lure Jeff outside, away from the phone. I think there's something wrong with the boat, I said, trying to sound convincing. Mike might need help. Jeff hesitated, then nodded. Let's go. I followed him outside, my heart pounding. As we neared the boat, I saw Mike struggling in the mud, trying to get up. Jeff rushed to help him, and I took my chance. I ran back to the house, grabbed the phone, and dialed the local police. My hands were shaking, but I managed to explain the situation. They said they'd send someone right away. I locked the doors and waited, my heart racing. I knew it was only a matter of time before Mike and Jeff came back. I needed to stay hidden until help arrived. I heard footsteps on the porch, followed by banging on the door. Let us in, Mike shouted. I stayed silent, hiding in a closet. The banging grew louder, more desperate. I heard the sound of glass breaking and knew they were inside. I held my breath, trying to stay calm. The minutes felt like hours. I prayed the police would arrive soon. Suddenly, I heard sirens in the distance. Mike and Jeff stopped searching, their footsteps growing frantic. They knew their time was up. The police arrived, bursting through the door. They found me hiding and quickly apprehended Mike and Jeff. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The officers took my statement and assured me I was safe. Mike and Jeff were taken into custody, their plans thwarted. I spent the rest of the night at the police station, grateful to be alive. Working at a call center can be pretty routine. You answer calls, help people with their problems, and repeat. But one night, things took a terrifying turn. It was around 3 a.m., and I was getting ready to wrap up my shift when I got a call from an unknown number. I answered, and immediately, I could hear the fear in the woman's voice on the other end. She was crying, begging for help, saying she was being held captive. My heart started pounding as she described her situation, saying she didn't know where she was and that she needed someone to rescue her. I tried to keep calm and reassure her that help was on the way. But then, the call cut off abruptly, leaving me with nothing but silence on the line. I felt a chill run down my spine as I tried to process what had just happened. I debated calling the police, but without knowing where the woman was or who she was, I didn't know how much they could do. I decided to try and trace the call instead. I pulled up the logs and saw that it came from a blocked number, which wasn't much help. But then, another call came in from the same number. I answered quickly, hoping to get more information. This time, the woman sounded even more frantic, saying she could hear footsteps outside her door and that she didn't have much time. I begged her to stay on the line, to keep talking to me so I could try and figure out where she was. But before I could get any more information, the call cut off again. I felt a sense of helplessness wash over me as I realized I might be her only hope. I called my supervisor and explained the situation, hoping they would know what to do. They told me to keep trying to trace the calls and to keep them updated on any new information. I felt a little better knowing I had someone else to help me through this. For the next hour, I answered call after call, each one more distressing than the last. The woman sounded terrified, and I could hear the desperation in her voice as she pleaded for help. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't trace the calls back to a specific location. Just when I was starting to lose hope, I got another call from the same number. This time, the woman sounded calmer, almost resigned. She told me that she didn't think she was going to make it out alive and that she wanted me to know she was grateful for my help. I tried to keep her talking, to get any information I could, but before I could say anything else, the call cut off for the final time. I sat there in stunned silence, feeling a wave of sadness wash over me. I had failed her. I called the police and gave them all the information I had, hoping they would be able to track down the woman and rescue her. But deep down, I knew it might be too late. The rest of my shift passed in a blur, my mind consumed with thoughts of the woman and what might have happened to her. When my shift finally ended, I went home, but I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that lingered over me. The next day, I saw a news report about a woman who had been rescued from a basement where she had been held captive for weeks. My heart sank as I realized it was the same woman from the calls. I felt a mix of relief and sadness knowing she was safe now, but I couldn't help but wonder if things could have been different if I had been able to help her sooner. Working at a call center, you never know what kind of calls you'll get or what kind of horrors you might uncover. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget the sound of that woman's voice, pleading for help in the darkness. I was cruising through the desert, just me and the open road stretching out before me. The sun beat down relentlessly, turning the landscape into a shimmering mirage. I hadn't seen another car for miles, so when I spotted a minivan pulled over on the side of the road, I figured they must be in trouble. I slowed down and pulled up behind them, rolling down my window to see if they needed help. A man stepped out from the driver's seat, waving me over with a grateful smile. He looked to be in his 40s, with a tired expression and a dusty hat pulled low over his eyes. As I approached, he explained that their minivan had broken down, leaving them stranded in the middle of nowhere. He gestured towards the vehicle, where a woman and 2 children sat waiting in the shade of a nearby rock. Without hesitation, I offered to help. I had a toolbox in the back of my truck, and I figured I could at least take a look and see if I could get their engine running again. The man thanked me profusely, relief evident in his voice. I popped the hood and got to work, tinkering with the engine while the family watched anxiously from the shade. It didn't take long for me to diagnose the problem, a loose wire that had come disconnected. I quickly fixed it and slammed the hood shut, wiping my hands on my jeans. The man was overjoyed, shaking my hand and thanking me again and again. He insisted that I join them for dinner as a way of saying thanks, and though I was hesitant at first, I eventually agreed. After all, it was the least I could do. We piled into their minivan and set off down the road, the sun sinking lower in the sky. As we drove, the man made small talk, asking me about my life and where I was headed. I answered politely, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We eventually arrived at their home, a rundown farmhouse nestled in the desert. It looked like something out of a horror movie, with peeling paint and broken windows. But I brushed off my unease, chalking it up to nerves. The man led me inside, where the smell of cooking food wafted through the air. The woman and children were waiting for us at the table, their smiles wide and welcoming. But as I took my seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As we ate, the conversation turned to strange topics, things that didn't make sense in polite company. The man talked about his past, about how he had lost everything and had to start over from scratch. The woman and children sat in silence, their eyes fixed on me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to make excuses and leave, but the man insisted that I stay the night. He said it wasn't safe to drive in the dark, and that I could sleep on the couch until morning. Reluctantly, I agreed, though every fiber of my being screamed at me to get out while I still could. That night, I lay awake on the couch, the sound of the wind howling outside the only thing keeping me company. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong, that I was in danger. And then, in the dead of night, I heard it, the sound of footsteps creeping down the hallway towards me. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, straining to listen for any sign of danger. And that's when I saw them, the man, the woman, and the children, standing in the doorway, their eyes gleaming with malice. They were no longer the grateful family I had met on the side of the road. They were something else entirely, something dark and twisted. I knew I had to get out of there, to escape before it was too late. With a surge of adrenaline, I leaped off the couch and bolted for the door, ignoring their shouts and cries behind me. I sprinted through the darkness, the desert stretching out before me like an endless expanse of nothingness. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, panting and gasping for breath. With shaking hands, I fumbled for my keys and started the engine, tearing out of there as fast as I could. I didn't look back as I drove, the fear and adrenaline fueling my every move. And as the farmhouse disappeared in the rearview mirror, I knew that I had narrowly escaped the clutches of something unspeakably evil. But the memory of that night would haunt me forever, a reminder of the darkness that lurks in the most unexpected of places. I was embarking on a solo road trip along the scenic Pacific Coast Highway, eager for adventure and new experiences. The rugged coastline stretched out before me, the crashing waves and salty air filling me with a sense of freedom and possibility. But as I drove deeper into the secluded areas, the thrill of the open road began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The winding highway seemed to stretch on forever, the dense forests and rocky cliffs closing in around me like silent sentinels. Suddenly, my car sputtered and lurched to a stop, leaving me stranded on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was completely alone, with no cell service and no one around to help. Desperate for assistance, I set out on foot, hoping to find a nearby farmhouse or gas station where I could get help. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After what felt like hours of walking, I finally spotted a farmhouse nestled among the trees, its windows glowing warmly in the fading light. Relief flooded through me as I hurried towards it, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I approached the farmhouse, a chill ran down my spine. There was something off about the place, something that sent alarm bells ringing in the back of my mind. Summoning all of my courage, I knocked on the door, hoping that whoever lived there would be able to help me. But as the door creaked open, my blood ran cold. Standing before me was a man, his eyes dark and unreadable, his expression inscrutable. He welcomed me inside with a smile, but there was something about him that set my teeth on edge. Ignoring my instincts, I stepped into the farmhouse, my senses on high alert as I took in my surroundings. The interior was dimly lit and cluttered, with strange symbols adorning the walls and shelves filled with mysterious objects. As the man led me further into the farmhouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a trap. But before I could turn and run, he motioned towards a chair and urged me to sit down. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I obeyed, my heart hammering in my chest as I tried to think of a way to escape. But before I could come up with a plan, the man began to speak, his voice low and soothing. He told me that I was safe here, that he and his family were just simple farmers, living off the land and minding their own business. But as he spoke, I noticed something strange about his demeanor, something that didn't quite add up. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed through the farmhouse, causing me to jump in alarm. The man's eyes flickered with something unreadable, and for a moment, I thought I saw a glimmer of malice in them. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I realized that I was in danger, that the man and his family were not who they claimed to be. But before I could make a move, he lunged towards me, his hands reaching out to grab me. With a scream, I leaped out of my chair and bolted towards the door, my heart pounding in my chest as I raced through the farmhouse. Behind me, I could hear the man's heavy footsteps as he pursued me, his voice raised in anger. But I refused to look back, refused to let fear consume me. With every ounce of strength I had, I pushed myself forward, my lungs burning and my legs aching as I ran for my life. Finally, I burst through the front door and into the cool night air, my heart racing and adrenaline coursing through my veins. Without looking back, I sprinted away from the farmhouse, my only thought to put as much distance between myself and those sinister inhabitants as possible. Hours later, I stumbled into a nearby town, exhausted and terrified but alive. And as I collapsed onto a bench, gasping for breath, I knew that I had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. But as I sat there, shaking and trembling, I couldn't shake the feeling that those dark forces were still out there, lurking in the shadows. I'm the keeper of a lighthouse, and let me tell you about the scariest night of my life. It was during a storm, one of those really bad ones that rattles the windows and shakes the whole building. I was up in the tower, doing my usual rounds and keeping an eye on the sea. That's when I saw it, a shipwrecked sailor clinging to a piece of driftwood, desperately trying to stay afloat in the churning waters. My heart went out to him, knowing that he was in serious trouble out there. So I did what any decent person would do. I let him in. I guided him up to the lighthouse, trying to be a good Samaritan and offer him shelter from the storm. But as soon as he stepped inside, I knew that something was wrong. There was something about him, something in his eyes that set off alarm bells in my head. He was hostile from the start, demanding food and shelter like he owned the place. I tried to reason with him, to tell him that I was just trying to help. But he wasn't having any of it, getting more aggressive by the minute. I knew I had to do something, to protect myself and the lighthouse from this dangerous man. So I tried to reason with him, to calm him down and get him to see reason. But he wasn't interested in listening, too caught up in his own anger and frustration. That's when he made his move, lunging at me with a knife in his hand. I barely had time to react, dodging out of the way and trying to defend myself as best as I could. It was like something out of a nightmare, like I was trapped in some kind of horror movie. I managed to grab hold of a nearby lamp and swing it at him, knocking him off balance and giving me enough time to make a run for it. I didn't stop running until I was miles away from the lighthouse, until I was sure that he couldn't follow me anymore. I called for help as soon as I could, telling them what had happened and begging them to come and get me. It felt like hours before they finally arrived, like I was trapped in some kind of endless nightmare. But eventually they found me, and they took me back to safety. I never found out what happened to that sailor, whether they caught him or whether he managed to slip away into the night. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget that night for as long as I live. It was the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, and it's something that I hope I never have to experience again. It was pouring rain, and I could barely see the road ahead. The storm was one of the worst I'd seen in years. I was driving home after a long day at work, just wanting to get back to my warm bed. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, and my knuckles were white. The windshield wipers were on full blast, but they struggled against the sheets of rain. Suddenly, my car jerked and sputtered. The engine light came on, and then the car just died. I managed to steer it to the side of the road before it completely gave out. I sat there for a minute, trying to figure out what to do. My phone was dead, of course. I had forgotten to charge it at work. I turned on the emergency flashers and got out of the car, the rain immediately soaking through my clothes. I popped the hood and stared at the engine, but I didn't know what I was looking for. I wasn't a mechanic. As I stood there, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, coming closer. It was a tow truck. Relief washed over me. The truck pulled up behind my car, and a man got out. He was tall and bulky, wearing a raincoat and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. "Need some help?" he called out over the sound of the rain. "Yeah, my car just died," I replied, trying to sound grateful but feeling uneasy. There was something off about him that I couldn't put my finger on. He walked over and looked under the hood, then back at me. "Looks like you've got a serious problem here. I can tow you to my garage, get it fixed up." I hesitated. "Where's your garage?" "Not too far," he said, but he didn't give an exact location. "Hop in the truck, I'll get you out of this storm." I didn't have many options. The storm was getting worse, and I couldn't stay out here all night. I got into the passenger side of the tow truck, and he climbed in after me, slamming the door shut. As we drove, I noticed he wasn't taking the main roads. Instead, he turned down a narrow, winding road that I didn't recognize. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Shortcut," he said, not looking at me. "We'll be there soon." I watched the dark trees whip by, my unease growing. I tried to remember if I'd seen any signs for a garage nearby, but nothing came to mind. The rain was relentless, pounding against the roof of the truck. After a few more minutes, I saw a small, dimly lit building up ahead. It looked more like a shed than a garage. He pulled up in front of it and got out, coming around to my side. "Here we are," he said, opening my door. I stepped out, the rain hitting me again. The place looked deserted. No lights on inside, no other cars. "This is your garage?" I asked, doubt creeping into my voice. "Yeah," he said. "Come on in, I'll show you." Every instinct told me to run, but where would I go? I followed him inside. The inside was even worse. It was cluttered with old parts and tools, and there was a faint smell of oil and something else I couldn't identify. "Wait here," he said, disappearing into another room. I stood there, my heart pounding. I looked around for anything I could use as a weapon, just in case. I spotted a rusty wrench on a workbench and grabbed it, holding it behind my back. He came back a moment later, a strange smile on his face. "Why don't you sit down? This might take a while." I shook my head. "I think I'll stand." He stepped closer, and I could see the glint in his eyes. "You're not going anywhere, you know that, right?" Panic surged through me. I swung the wrench, hitting him on the shoulder. He shouted in pain, but it only seemed to make him angrier. He lunged at me, and I stumbled back, knocking over a stack of boxes. I ran for the door, wrench still in hand. He was right behind me, but I managed to get outside. The rain was blinding, but I kept running. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away from him. I heard him shouting behind me, but I didn't stop. I ran down the road, my lungs burning and my legs aching. The rain was so heavy, it felt like I was running through a wall of water. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw headlights coming toward me. I waved my arms frantically, and the car slowed down. It was another tow truck, but this one had a logo on the side and looked legitimate. The driver rolled down the window. "You okay, buddy?" I was gasping for breath. "Help, someone's after me." He looked past me and saw the other man coming. He quickly got out and pulled me into his truck. "Stay down," he said, getting back behind the wheel. He locked the doors and drove off, the other man disappearing into the storm behind us. I didn't relax until we were miles away. The driver called the police, and they met us at a nearby station. I told them everything, and they went out to find the man who had tried to trap me. I never found out what happened to him. The police said the place he took me to was abandoned, and there was no sign of him when they arrived. But I knew I'd never forget that night, and I'd never take help from a stranger so easily again. The rain started just after we arrived at the cabin. Jenny, Alex, Rachel, and I had planned this weekend getaway for months. It was supposed to be a break from our hectic lives, just a couple of days to relax, play games, and catch up. The cabin was cozy, tucked away in the woods, perfect for what we needed. By nightfall, the storm had turned fierce. The wind howled, and the rain hammered the windows. We had a fire going in the fireplace, the only light in the room since the power had gone out. We huddled around, telling stories and laughing, trying to ignore the weather outside. Around 10 p.m., there was a knock on the door. It was so unexpected that we all jumped. I exchanged a look with Jenny, then got up to see who it could be. Through the peephole, I saw a man, soaking wet, shivering. He looked desperate. I cracked the door open, keeping the chain on. "Can I help you?" "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice shaking. "My car broke down a mile back. Can I come in and use your phone to call for help?" My gut told me something was off. There's no phone service up here, and the power's out. His eyes darted around, like he was thinking. "Please, I just need to get out of the rain." Jenny came up behind me. "Maybe we should let him in, just for a bit." Reluctantly, I unchained the door. The man stepped in, water pooling on the floor around him. He looked around the cabin, and I noticed his eyes lingered on each of us a bit too long. "Thank you," he said. "I'm Tom." We introduced ourselves, though I felt uneasy. He sat by the fire, warming his hands. "It's really coming down out there," he said, trying to make small talk. "Yeah," Alex replied. "We're lucky we got here before it started." Tom nodded, then looked at me. "You sure there's no phone service? Not even a landline?" "No, nothing," I said. "We're pretty isolated here." Rachel, who had been quiet, finally spoke up. "What happened to your car?" Tom hesitated, then said, "Hit something in the road, maybe a branch. Engine just died." Rachel looked at me, her eyebrows raised. I knew she was thinking the same thing I was. His story didn't add up. I walked through a storm to a cabin with no guarantee of help. I decided to test him. "We have a radio in the back. Maybe you can get a signal and call for help." Tom's face twitched, but he smiled. "That would be great, thanks." I led him to the back room, where we kept the old radio. As he fiddled with it, I noticed something sticking out of his coat pocket. It looked like a piece of paper, but I couldn't make out what it was. "Weird that your car died so suddenly," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. Where are you heading? Just passing through, he replied, not looking up from the radio. His answers were too vague. I needed to talk to the others without him hearing. Let me check on the others, I said, and quickly left the room. Back in the living room, I whispered to Jenny, Alex, and Rachel. Something's wrong. His story doesn't add up. Rachel nodded. I thought the same thing. He seems too calm. What do we do? Alex asked, glancing nervously at the hallway. We need to stay together, I said, and watch him closely. Tom came back out, shaking his head. No luck with the radio. Looks like I'm stuck here until the storm passes. We nodded, trying to act natural. But the tension was thick. We played a game of cards, Tom joining in. Every time he looked away, we exchanged worried glances. Something about him was definitely off. After a while, Tom excused himself to use the bathroom. As soon as he was out of earshot, Rachel leaned in. We need to search his stuff. See if we can find anything. Agreed, I said. Alex, keep an eye on him. Rachel and I slipped into the back room. We found his coat and searched the pockets. There was a piece of paper, folded up. When we opened it, our blood ran cold. It was a map of the area, with our cabin circled in red. There were notes scribbled on it, timing, how many people, the layout of the cabin. This isn't random, Rachel whispered. He planned this. We heard footsteps and quickly put the paper back. Tom reappeared, looking at us suspiciously. What are you doing? Just checking something, I said, trying to stay calm. Tom's smile didn't reach his eyes. Everything okay? Yeah, fine, I replied, moving past him. We should get back to the others. Back in the living room, I discreetly showed Jenny and Alex the map. Their faces went pale. We knew we had to act fast. Tom was dangerous, and we were trapped with him. We needed a plan. I whispered to Jenny and Alex, telling them to follow my lead. Rachel distracted Tom with questions while we gathered supplies, anything we could use as weapons. A heavy flashlight, a kitchen knife, a fireplace poker. Tom was getting impatient. What's taking so long? He asked, eyes narrowing. Just a minute, I said, trying to sound casual. Rachel wanted to show you something. Tom followed Rachel to the back room, and we seized the moment. We barricaded the front door and windows, then hid near the hallway, weapons in hand. When Tom realized Rachel had tricked him, he stormed back out, furious. What's going on here? He demanded, his face twisted with rage. Get out of our cabin, I said, stepping forward with the flashlight raised. Tom's eyes darted to the door, then back at us. You don't understand. I need this place. No, you need to leave, Jenny said, holding the knife steady. Tom lunged at us, but we were ready. Alex swung the poker, catching him in the side. He stumbled, and Jenny jabbed the knife forward, not enough to injure him seriously, but enough to make him back off. Get out. I shouted again. Tom looked at us, breathing hard. Then he turned and bolted for the back door. We didn't chase him, just locked it behind him and collapsed in relief. We spent the rest of the night on high alert, but Tom didn't come back. When morning finally came, the storm had passed. We packed up quickly and left the cabin, reporting the incident to the local authorities as soon as we got to town. They found Tom's abandoned car, but no sign of him. It was clear he had been planning something bad, and we were lucky to have escaped unharmed. That weekend getaway turned into a nightmare, one we wouldn't forget. I worked the graveyard shift at this 24-hour convenience store. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills. One night, things got real weird. There was this car parked outside for hours, just sitting there with the engine running. I thought maybe they were waiting for someone, so I didn't think much of it at first. Hours went by, and the car was still there. I started to get a little uneasy. Who just sits in their car for that long? Around 3 a.m., the driver finally came inside. He was a tall guy, looked to be in his 30s, with wild eyes and a jittery demeanor. He walked up to the counter and started pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. I tried to act normal, but I could feel the tension in the air. He kept glancing over his shoulder like he was expecting someone to come after him. I asked if he needed help with anything, but he just shook his head and kept pacing. I could see the bulge of something in his jacket pocket, and my heart started racing. Was he armed? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He finally stopped pacing and stared at me with those wild eyes. "You ever feel like you're being watched?" he asked, his voice low and intense. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, trying to play it cool. He started rambling about how he was being followed, how he needed to lay low for a while. I tried to calm him down, but he was on edge, like he was ready to bolt at any moment. I didn't want to escalate the situation, so I just listened, hoping he would leave soon. But he didn't leave. He stayed for what felt like hours, pacing and muttering to himself. I kept an eye on him, ready to hit the panic button under the counter if things got out of hand. Eventually, he seemed to calm down a bit and wandered off to the back of the store. I took the opportunity to grab my phone and discreetly call the police. I explained the situation to them, and they said they would send someone over as soon as they could. I felt a little better knowing help was on the way, but I was still on edge. I kept watching the guy out of the corner of my eye as he wandered around the store, picking up random items and putting them back down. He seemed restless, like he couldn't sit still for more than a few seconds. Suddenly, he froze, his eyes widening in fear. He turned to me, his face pale. "They found me," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I have to get out of here." Before I could react, he bolted for the door and disappeared into the night. I stood there, stunned, not sure what to do. I wanted to follow him, make sure he was okay, but I knew it was too dangerous. I waited anxiously for the police to arrive, hoping they would catch up with him and make sure he was safe. When they finally got there, I told them everything that had happened. They searched the area but didn't find any sign of the guy. They said they would keep an eye out for him and let me know if they found anything. I spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every little sound. I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was going to happen. But when the sun finally came up and my shift ended, I was relieved to make it out of there in one piece. I don't know what happened to that guy, but I hope he's okay. Working the graveyard shift, you see all kinds of strange things, but that night was something else entirely. It's a reminder that you never know what might happen when you're working alone in the middle of the night. Working as a security guard at the warehouse was usually uneventful. My shifts were long and mostly quiet, but I liked the solitude. It was a huge place, filled with rows of crates and boxes stacked high. I'd walk the aisles, making sure everything was secure. Most nights, nothing happened. One night, I was patrolling the north section, which was supposed to be empty. It was a new part of the warehouse that wasn't in use yet. I walked down the long, dimly lit aisle, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The silence was comforting, a break from the usual hum of machinery. As I reached the far end, I heard a faint noise. It was like a soft thud, followed by muffled voices. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. The noises were coming from behind a stack of crates. My first thought was that it might be some animals that got in, but the voices were unmistakably human. I felt a chill run down my spine. This area was supposed to be empty. No one was allowed back here. I radioed in, but the static on the other end told me I was out of range. I decided to check it out myself before raising the alarm. I crept closer, trying to be as quiet as possible. As I rounded the corner, I saw a faint light spilling out from behind a stack of crates. I moved slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. When I peeked around the crates, I saw them. There were 5 men, all armed. They had set up a small camp with laptops and equipment that looked expensive. They were talking in hushed tones, focused on their screens. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but it was clear they were up to something illegal. I backed away slowly, trying to stay out of sight. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I needed to get out of there and call for help. As I turned to leave, my foot hit a loose piece of metal, and it clanged loudly against the concrete floor. The men looked up instantly, their eyes scanning the darkness. I froze, hoping they hadn't seen me. One of them barked an order, and 2 of the men started moving towards me, their guns drawn. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty aisles. I could hear them behind me, shouting for me to stop. I took a sharp turn and ducked behind a stack of boxes, trying to catch my breath. I needed to find a way out before they caught up to me. I looked around, my mind racing. There was a side door not too far from where I was hiding. If I could make it there, I might be able to get out and call for help. I peeked out from behind the boxes, seeing the men searching the area, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I waited until they moved further down the aisle before making a break for the door. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my ears. I reached the door and pushed it open, slipping outside into the cold night air. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking. The operator answered, and I quickly explained the situation. They assured me that help was on the way. I stayed outside, hidden in the shadows, waiting. It felt like an eternity before I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. I saw the red and blue lights flashing as the police cars pulled up. The officers got out and moved into the warehouse, their guns drawn. I stayed hidden, watching as they went in. It wasn't long before they came back out with the men in handcuffs. I breathed a sigh of relief, feeling the tension drain from my body. One of the officers came over to me, asking if I was all right. I nodded, still shaken but grateful they had arrived. I explained what had happened, and they took my statement. They told me that the men were part of a smuggling ring and had been using the warehouse as a base of operations. They had been looking for them for a while. I thanked the officers and watched as they took the men away. I knew it would be a long night of paperwork and questions, but I was just glad it was over. The warehouse felt different now, less safe. I knew I would never forget what happened that night. I worked as a receptionist at a small hotel, a quiet place on the edge of town. Most nights were uneventful, with few guests and nothing much happening. That changed when the guest in room 213 checked in. The man seemed ordinary enough, checked in late at night, didn't say much. He paid for a week up front, then took his key and went to his room. I didn't think much of it at first. We had guests like him all the time. After a few days, I realized I hadn't seen him since he checked in. Normally, guests would come and go, at least leave the room for meals or a walk. but room 213 was silent, no sound, no movement. It started to bother me. I checked the computer and saw that his keycard hadn't been used to leave or enter the room since the night he arrived. I thought maybe he was just keeping to himself, but it still seemed strange. On the fourth day, I decided to check on him. I knocked on the door of room 213, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. I considered using the master key, but I didn't want to invade his privacy. I went back to the front desk, still feeling uneasy. Later that night, I noticed something even stranger. The lock record showed the door to room 213 had been opened several times during the past few days, but not by the guest's keycard. It was opened by the master key, the one only staff had access to. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had been entering room 213, but it wasn't the guest. I decided to wait until my shift ended and then go check the room myself. At the end of my shift, I grabbed the master key and headed up to the second floor. The hallway was silent, the dim lights flickering slightly. I reached room 213 and took a deep breath before unlocking the door. The room was dark, the curtains drawn. I fumbled for the light switch and turned it on. The bed was made, everything seemed normal at first glance. But then I noticed the closet door was slightly ajar. I walked over to the closet and pulled the door open. Inside, I found a pile of clothes that didn't belong to the guest, men's and women's clothing, all mixed together. There was also a strange smell, like something rotten. My heart was pounding as I turned around to check the bathroom. The door was closed, and I could see a faint light coming from underneath. I knocked, but there was no response. I slowly pushed the door open and was hit by the stench of decay. The guest was there, lying in the bathtub, eyes wide open, but lifeless. His skin was pale, and he looked like he had been dead for days. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. That's when I heard a noise behind me. I turned around and saw a man standing in the doorway. He wasn't a guest. He was dressed in dark clothes, his face partially hidden by a hood. "Who are you?" I managed to stammer. The man didn't answer. He just stared at me, his eyes cold and empty. I tried to run, but he was faster. He grabbed me by the arm and pulled me into the room, slamming the door shut. I struggled, but he was too strong. He shoved me against the wall, his hand over my mouth. "Stay quiet," he hissed, "or you'll end up like him." I nodded, too terrified to do anything else. He let go of me and started searching the room, pulling out drawers, tossing things around. I didn't know what he was looking for, but I knew I had to get out of there. I waited until he was distracted, then made a dash for the door. I managed to unlock it and ran down the hallway, my heart racing. I didn't stop until I was outside, in the parking lot, gasping for breath. I called the police, and they arrived within minutes. They searched the room and found the man hiding in the closet. He was arrested, and the police later told me he was wanted for multiple murders. The guest in room 213 had been one of his victims. I never went back to that hotel. I couldn't. The memory of that night still haunts me, the feeling of being watched, the smell of death, the cold eyes of a killer. I'll never forget it, and I hope no one else ever has to go through something like that. The road stretched out endlessly before me, winding its way through the heart of the countryside as I drove on my cross-country road trip. I had been traveling for days, exploring new destinations and scouting for potential spots to recommend to my clients back home. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape, I decided it was time to find a place to rest for the night. Spotting a quaint bed and breakfast nestled on the outskirts of a small town, I pulled into the gravel parking lot and parked my car. The building looked charming and inviting, its warm lights glowing softly through the windows as if beckoning me inside. Stepping out of the car, I stretched my tired limbs and made my way to the front door, the crunch of gravel beneath my feet echoing in the stillness of the evening. As I entered the inn, I was greeted by the warm aroma of home-cooked food and the sound of soft music playing in the background. The innkeeper, a kindly-looking woman with silver hair and a warm smile, welcomed me and showed me to my room. It was cozy and inviting, with floral wallpaper and a plush bed that looked like it would be perfect for a good night's sleep. As I settled in for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the inn. There was an air of secrecy about the place, a feeling that there were hidden depths lurking beneath its charming exterior. Unable to shake my unease, I decided to do a little exploring. Slipping out of my room, I made my way down the narrow hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet as I went. I came to a staircase leading down to the basement and hesitated for a moment before descending into the darkness below. The air was cool and musty, and I felt a shiver run down my spine as I stepped into the dimly lit room below. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw rows of shelves lining the walls, each one stacked with jars filled with strange, unidentifiable substances. My heart began to race as I realized that I had stumbled upon something sinister, something that I was never meant to see. Before I could make sense of what I was seeing, I heard footsteps echoing in the darkness behind me. Whirling around, I saw the innkeeper standing in the doorway, her smile replaced by a cold, calculating expression. I knew then that I was in danger, that I had stumbled upon something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I turned and fled, racing back up the stairs and out into the night. As I sprinted across the parking lot to my car, I heard the sound of pursuit behind me, the innkeeper's voice calling out for me to stop. Ignoring her cries, I fumbled with my keys and threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it tight. With trembling hands, I started the engine and peeled out of the parking lot, leaving the bed and breakfast far behind me. As I drove into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me, the fear that I had narrowly escaped a fate far worse than anything I could have imagined. But one thing was for sure, I would never forget the terror of that night, the feeling of being hunted like prey in the darkness of that quaint little inn. My gas gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, so I pulled into a remote gas station that seemed to materialize out of the darkness. As I stepped out of my car, the chill of the night air sent shivers down my spine. The station was eerily quiet, with no signs of life except for a faint glow emanating from the storefront. I made my way toward the building, my footsteps echoing in the silence like a drumbeat. When I pushed open the door and stepped inside, I was greeted by a scene straight out of a nightmare. The attendant behind the counter was hunched over, muttering to himself incoherently, his eyes darting back and forth like a cornered animal. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as a wave of unease washed over me. I approached the counter cautiously, trying to keep my voice steady as I asked for a fill-up. But the attendant's response was anything but reassuring. He just continued to mutter and mumble, his movements jerky and erratic, like a puppet on strings. That's when I noticed it, the faint smell of something foul lingering in the air, like rotting meat left out in the sun. My stomach churned in revulsion as I realized that something was seriously wrong here, that I had stumbled upon something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. I glanced around the store, searching for any sign of help or escape, but there was none to be found. The walls seemed to press in around me, trapping me in this nightmare with no way out. I knew I had to get out of there, to escape before it was too late. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I turned to leave, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. But as I reached for the door, a voice called out from behind me, freezing me in place like a deer caught in headlights. I turned slowly, my blood running cold as I saw the look of malice in the attendant's eyes, the twisted grin spreading across his face like a spider weaving its web. In that moment, I knew I was in grave danger, that I had stumbled upon something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. With a surge of adrenaline, I bolted for the door, throwing it open and sprinting into the night with all the speed I could muster. I could hear the sound of footsteps echoing behind me, getting closer and closer with each passing moment. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I ran faster and faster, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest, until I couldn't run anymore. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I saw it, the lights of a passing car, like a beacon of hope in the darkness. With a desperate cry for help, I stumbled onto the road, waving my arms frantically as the car screeched to a halt beside me. I didn't wait for it to come to a complete stop. I threw open the door and practically dove inside, my heart pounding in my chest like a jackhammer. I told the driver everything, about the gas station, about the attendant, about the danger I had narrowly escaped. They listened in horrified silence, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief. We drove to the nearest police station, where I recounted my story to the authorities, every word dripping with urgency and desperation. They promised to investigate, to get to the bottom of what had happened and bring those responsible to justice. I was out there, just me in the woods. I set up camp in this remote clearing, thinking it was the perfect spot for the night. Everything seemed normal, just the sounds of the forest all around me. But as night fell, things started to get weird. I heard this distant drumming, like something out of a tribal ritual. At first, I thought maybe it was just my imagination, but then I heard the chanting. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rustling of the trees. But as the night wore on, it got louder and louder, like it was coming from all around me. I tried to ignore it, to focus on getting some sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I could hear those drums pounding in my head. I started to feel this sense of unease, like I was being watched. I wanted to pack up and get out of there, but something held me back, some morbid curiosity that I couldn't shake. I tried to convince myself that it was just a bunch of locals having a party or something, but deep down, I knew there was something more sinister going on. I lay there in my tent, listening to the chanting, feeling more and more like I was in some kind of nightmare. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I heard footsteps outside my tent. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. The footsteps grew closer and closer, until they were right outside my tent. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they stopped. I lay there, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The forest was silent once again, like nothing had ever happened. I don't know how long I lay there, too terrified to move. But eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up the next morning, the forest was quiet, like nothing had ever happened. But the memory of that night still haunts me, like a dark shadow lurking in the back of my mind. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could and got out of there, vowing never to return to that cursed clearing again. And even now, as I sit here writing this, I can still hear the distant echo of those drums, reminding me of the darkness that lurks in the heart of the woods. I'm a wildlife biologist, spending my days studying animal behavior in the secluded depths of the forest. It's a solitary job, but I thrive on the challenge of unraveling the mysteries of nature. On one particular expedition, I found myself deep in the heart of the forest, observing a pack of wolves as they hunted their prey. But as I watched from my hidden vantage point, I noticed something strange. The wolves were exhibiting aggressive behavior unlike anything I had ever seen before. At first, I chalked it up to natural instincts, but as I continued to observe, I realized that there was something more going on. The wolves seemed to be working together with a sense of purpose, as if they were being controlled by some unseen force. Intrigued, I decided to investigate further, determined to uncover the truth behind their strange behavior. But as I ventured deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I stumbled upon a clearing in the trees, a clearing that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. In the center of the clearing stood a group of people, their faces obscured by masks as they chanted in a language I didn't understand. I watched in horror as the wolves gathered around them, their eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. It was like something out of a nightmare, a twisted ritual that seemed to bind the wolves to the will of their human masters. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was in grave danger. I knew I had to get out of there before the wolves and their mysterious handlers noticed me. With trembling hands, I backed away from the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I had just witnessed. But before I could escape, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. I turned to see a group of masked figures emerging from the trees, their eyes fixed on me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I had to get out of there, to escape before they caught up to me, and I became their next victim. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with reckless abandon. I could hear the wolves howling in the distance, their voices echoing through the forest like a chorus of doom. But even as I fled, I knew that I couldn't outrun them forever. I needed to find a way to outsmart them, to use my knowledge of the forest to my advantage. With every step, I searched for a way out, my senses on high alert as I navigated the treacherous terrain. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through me as I raced against time to escape the relentless pursuit of the wolves and their sinister handlers. And then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I caught sight of a narrow passageway up ahead, a glimmer of light shining through the darkness like a beacon of hope. With renewed determination, I pushed myself towards it, ignoring the pain and exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm me. And then, finally, I burst through the surface and into the open air, gasping for breath as I emerged from the depths of the forest. I collapsed onto the ground, exhausted and shaken, but alive. I was working the night shift at the hospital, just like any other night. The storm outside was raging, the rain beating against the windows, and the wind howling like a banshee. It was the kind of storm that made you grateful to be indoors, safe and dry. But then, everything changed. A patient was brought in by the storm. They said he had been found by the side of the road, disoriented and injured. They didn't know who he was or where he came from. All they knew was that he needed help. I went to check on him, expecting to find just another patient in need of care. But when I entered his room, something felt off. He was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling with vacant eyes. His breathing was shallow and ragged, and there was a wildness in his gaze that made me uneasy. I approached him cautiously, trying to assess his condition. But as soon as I got close, he lashed out, grabbing me by the throat with surprising strength. His eyes were filled with rage, and I could see the madness swirling behind them. I struggled to break free, but he was too strong. He pushed me against the wall, his grip tightening around my neck. I could feel the air being squeezed out of my lungs, and panic surged through me. I knew I had to do something, anything, to survive. With all the strength I could muster, I fought back, kicking and punching at him with all my might. Eventually, I managed to break free, gasping for air as I stumbled away from him. But he wasn't done yet. He lunged at me again, his fists flying, and I dodged out of the way just in time. Adrenaline surged through me as I fought to defend myself, knowing that my life depended on it. I tried to reason with him, to calm him down, but he was beyond reason. His eyes were filled with madness, and he seemed to be driven by some unseen force. All he wanted was to hurt me, to destroy me. I knew I had to get help, but the storm outside had knocked out the power, and the hospital was in chaos. I was on my own, trapped with a violent patient who seemed intent on killing me. I backed away slowly, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. But he followed me, his movements relentless and predatory. I could see the hunger in his eyes, the thirst for blood. I knew I had to find a way out, to escape before it was too late. But everywhere I turned, he was there, blocking my path, cutting off my escape. I felt a surge of desperation as I realized that I was running out of options. I needed to think fast, to find a way to outsmart him, to outmaneuver him. And then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, I saw it. A glimmer of light, shining through the darkness. It was a door, a way out. I made a break for it, sprinting towards the door with all the speed I could muster. He was right behind me, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. But I was faster. I reached the door and threw it open, stepping out into the storm. The rain lashed against my face, the wind whipped at my clothes, but I didn't care. I was free. I ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I was far away from the hospital, far away from him. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. But I was alive. I had survived. And as I lay there in the darkness, listening to the storm rage on, I knew that I would never forget the terror of that night. The fear, the adrenaline, the desperate struggle for survival. It was a night I would never forget. And as long as I lived, I would never set foot in that hospital again. Hi, my name's Thomas and I work as a forest ranger, and there's this one time that I'll never forget. It was during a storm, one of those really bad ones that comes out of nowhere and hits you like a freight train. I was out on patrol, trying to make sure that everyone was safe and that no one was out there in the woods getting themselves into trouble. But then the storm hit, and it hit hard. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind was howling like a banshee. I knew I had to get back to the station, to hunker down and ride out the storm until it passed. I made it back just in time, as the rain started to come down even harder. I locked up the station and hunkered down inside, trying to wait out the storm and hoping that no one would be stupid enough to be out there in weather like this. But then I heard it, a knock on the door. I thought I must have been hearing things at first, but then I heard it again, louder this time. I cautiously made my way over to the door, trying to see through the rain and the darkness. There was a man standing there, soaked to the bone and shivering from the cold. He claimed that he had been out hiking and had gotten lost in the storm. He said he was looking for shelter, somewhere to wait out the weather until he could find his way back to safety. I didn't know what to do at first, whether to let him in or to turn him away. But then I figured that he was just some poor guy who had gotten caught out in the storm, like so many others. So I opened the door and let him inside, trying to be a good Samaritan and help him out in his time of need. But as soon as he stepped inside, I knew that something wasn't right. There was something about him, something in his eyes that made my skin crawl. It was like he was sizing me up, like he was trying to figure out if I was a threat or not. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself that I was just being paranoid. But then he started asking me all sorts of strange questions, like how many people were out there in the woods, and if I had any weapons on me. It was like he was trying to gauge whether or not he could overpower me. I started to get really nervous, my heart pounding in my chest as I realized that I might be in danger. I didn't know what to do, whether to try and kick him out or to try and placate him until the storm passed. But then he made his move, lunging at me with a knife in his hand. I barely had time to react, scrambling backwards and trying to defend myself as best as I could. It was like something out of a nightmare, like I was trapped in some kind of horror movie. I managed to grab hold of a chair and swing it at him, knocking him off balance and giving me enough time to make a run for it. I didn't stop running until I was miles away from the station, until I was sure that he couldn't follow me anymore. I called for help as soon as I could, telling them what had happened and begging them to come and get me. It felt like hours before they finally arrived, like I was trapped in some kind of endless nightmare. But eventually they found me, and they took me back to safety. I never found out what happened to that guy, whether they caught him or whether he managed to slip away into the night. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget that night for as long as I live. It was the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, and it's something that I hope I never have to experience again. I was working the night shift at the mountain lodge, just like any other night. It was quiet and the snow was falling outside, covering everything in a thick, white blanket. The lodge was almost empty, with only a few guests who had turned in early. I was at the front desk, doing some paperwork, when I heard a faint knocking on the door. I looked up, a bit surprised. We didn't usually get visitors this late, especially in this weather. I walked over to the door and saw a man standing outside. He was dressed in a heavy coat and looked completely lost. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with fear. I hesitated for a moment but decided to open the door. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked, letting him in. He nodded, shivering. "I got lost in the woods. My car broke down a few miles back, and I've been wandering around for hours." I felt a pang of sympathy for him. The weather was brutal, and being stuck out there could be dangerous. "Come in, warm up. Do you need anything? Coffee, maybe?" "Yes, please," he said, his voice shaky. I led him to the small lounge area and went to make some coffee. When I returned, he was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. I handed him the cup, and he took it with trembling hands. "Thank you," he said, taking a sip. "I'm Kevin, by the way." "Nice to meet you, Kevin." "I'm Mike," I replied. "What were you doing out there so late?" He glanced up at me, his eyes dark and intense. "I was visiting a friend, but I got lost on my way back. Then my car broke down, and, well, here I am." There was something off about his story, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I decided to let it go for now. "Well, you're safe here. We can call a tow truck in the morning." He nodded, but his gaze didn't leave the fire. I went back to the front desk, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. I kept an eye on Kevin as he warmed up by the fire. After a while, he got up and started pacing around the lounge. His movements were jerky, almost frantic. I watched him, trying to figure out what was going on. Suddenly, he stopped and looked straight at me. "Do you have a phone I can use?" he asked, his voice tense. "Sure, There's one right here, I said, pointing to the phone on the desk. He walked over and picked up the receiver, but then he just stood there, staring at it. I could see his hands shaking. Is everything all right? I asked, growing more concerned. He slammed the receiver down and backed away, his eyes wild. No, nothing is all right. They're after me. My heart started pounding. Who's after you? He didn't answer. Instead, he started mumbling to himself, his words too low for me to understand. I took a step back, trying to figure out what to do. I needed to keep him calm and find out what was going on. Kevin, you need to calm down. You're safe here. No one is going to hurt you, I said, trying to sound soothing. He shook his head violently. You don't understand. They're everywhere. They're coming for me. I glanced around, feeling the panic rise in my chest. There was no one else here, just us. I needed to get him to calm down before things got out of hand. Listen, let's sit down and talk about this. Maybe I can help. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and anger. You can't help me. No one can. Before I could react, he lunged at me, knocking me to the floor. I struggled to get free, but he was surprisingly strong. Get off me. I shouted, trying to push him away. He pinned me down, his face inches from mine. They're coming for you too, he whispered, his breath hot and stale. I finally managed to shove him off and scrambled to my feet. He was on the floor, breathing heavily. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking. I need help. There's a man here, and he's out of control, I said, my voice trembling. The operator assured me that help was on the way. I kept my distance from Kevin, watching him carefully. He was muttering to himself again, his eyes darting around the room. I could hear the sound of sirens in the distance, and relief washed over me. When the police arrived, Kevin didn't resist. They took him away, still mumbling about people coming after him. I gave my statement to the officers, explaining what had happened. They assured me that he would get the help he needed. After they left, I sat down, trying to process what had just happened. The lodge was quiet again, the only sound the crackling of the fire. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air. I knew I would never forget that night and the look in Kevin's eyes. I've been driving a taxi for about 10 years, mostly night shifts. It's quieter at night, fewer people, but you also get some strange ones. I thought I'd seen it all until that night. It was around 2 a.m., a quiet Tuesday. I was parked near the downtown area, waiting for a fare. A well-dressed man flagged me down. He was in a suit, looked like a businessman. He got in and gave me an address. It was a remote location outside the city, but nothing too unusual. We drove in silence for a while. He didn't seem like he wanted to chat, so I kept my eyes on the road. About 15 minutes in, I noticed him fidgeting in the back seat. He was looking out the window, then back at me in the rearview mirror. Something about his eyes made me uneasy. As we got closer to the destination, he suddenly leaned forward. His voice changed, colder, and he told me to turn off the main road. I hesitated, and he leaned in closer, his breath on my neck. Don't ask questions, he said, his voice low and threatening. Just drive. I turned off the road as he instructed. We were now on a narrow, unpaved path surrounded by trees. My heart was pounding, but I tried to stay calm. The path seemed to go on forever, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I glanced at the man in the rearview mirror. He was staring at me, a smirk on his face. After what felt like an eternity, he told me to stop. I pulled over, and he got out, gesturing for me to follow. I didn't want to, but I was too scared to refuse. He led me into the woods, and I could hear the crunch of leaves under our feet. The silence was deafening. We walked for a few minutes until we reached a small clearing. He stopped and turned to face me. "Give me your phone and your wallet," he demanded. I handed them over without hesitation. Then he said something that sent chills down my spine. "You're going to help me with something," he said, his eyes cold and empty. He pulled out a shovel from a nearby bush and threw it at my feet. "Dig," he ordered. My hands were shaking, but I started digging. The soil was hard, and the work was slow. He watched me, not saying a word. My mind was racing, trying to figure out a way out of this. After what felt like hours, I had dug a hole about 3 feet deep. He told me to stop, then walked over and looked into the hole. He seemed satisfied. "Get in," he said, and my heart nearly stopped. I thought this was it, that he was going to bury me alive. I hesitated, and he pulled out a gun. "Get in," he repeated, his voice deadly calm. I climbed into the hole, my mind screaming in terror. He looked down at me, and for a moment, I thought he was going to pull the trigger. But instead, he threw a bag into the hole. "Bury it," he said. I realized he wasn't planning to kill me, at least not yet. I quickly covered the bag with dirt, my hands moving frantically. When I was done, he told me to get out. I scrambled out of the hole, my body trembling. He made me fill the hole completely, then took the shovel and led me back to the car. We drove back to the main road in silence. My mind was racing, but I didn't dare say a word. When we reached the outskirts of the city, he told me to stop. He handed me my phone and wallet, then got out of the car. Before he closed the door, he leaned in and said, "If you tell anyone about this, I'll know." I drove off as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I got back to the city, I pulled over and threw up. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I sat there for a long time, trying to calm down. I didn't go to the police. I was too scared. What if he was watching? What if he came back for me? I never picked up another fare in that area again. Every time I see a well-dressed man, I feel a pang of fear. I still drive a taxi, but I'm always looking over my shoulder, wondering if he's out there, watching, waiting. I work the night shift at a gas station in a rural area. It's usually pretty quiet, just me and the occasional customer passing through. One night, around 2 a.m., a car with heavily tinted windows pulled up to the pump. I waited for the driver to get out, but they never did. I could feel their eyes on me, watching. After a few minutes, I decided to approach the car to see if they needed any help. As I got closer, the window rolled down just a crack. A voice from inside asked for a pack of cigarettes. It sounded calm, but something about it made me uneasy. I went back inside, grabbed the cigarettes, and brought them back to the car. The hand that reached out to take them was gloved, and I couldn't see the driver's face. I asked if they needed anything else, but the driver just said, "No," and rolled up the window. I went back inside, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over me. For a while, nothing happened. The car just sat there, engine idling. I kept glancing out the window, wondering why they weren't leaving. Finally, the car's horn honked, a short, sharp sound that made me jump. I stepped outside again and approached the car. The window rolled down just a bit more this time. The driver asked if I could check the tire pressure. I felt a bit more comfortable doing that, so I agreed. As I walked around the car, I could feel the driver's eyes on me. The tires were fine, but I pretended to adjust them, just to buy myself some time to think. When I finished, I walked back to the driver's side and told them everything was good. The driver didn't respond. The window stayed open, but the silence was unnerving. I went back to the station and watched the car from inside. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? A customer was acting weird. Then the car door opened, just a crack. I felt a chill run down my spine. The driver didn't get out, just sat there with the door slightly open. I couldn't see inside, the darkness and the tinted windows making it impossible. Minutes passed like hours. I was on edge, every sound making me jump. Finally, the driver spoke again, the voice crackling through the night air. "Can you come closer?" they asked. "I need to tell you something." I didn't want to, but I felt like I had no choice. I walked back over to the car, my heart pounding in my chest. The door opened a little more, but I still couldn't see the driver clearly. "I need you to deliver a message," the driver said. "Tell them it's done." "Who?" I asked, my voice shaking. "They'll know," the driver replied. "Just deliver the message." I stepped back, feeling more afraid than ever. I nodded and backed away, returning to the station. The car door closed, and the engine roared to life. The car sped off into the night, leaving me standing there, shaking. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to tell or what the message meant. For the rest of my shift, I kept expecting the car to come back, or for someone else to show up looking for me. When morning finally came, I went home, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. I kept thinking about that voice, those cryptic demands, and the way the driver watched me. I never delivered the message. I didn't know who to tell, and honestly, I was too scared to find out what it meant. I quit my job at the gas station a few days later, but I still think about that night. I still wonder who that driver was, what they wanted, and what they meant by "it's done." I hope I never find out. Working in the IT department of a skyscraper can be pretty routine. You spend most of your time fixing computer issues, troubleshooting network problems, and generally just keeping things running smoothly. But one night, things took a turn for the terrifying. I was working late, trying to track down the source of some strange network activity we had been noticing for a while. It was coming from an unused floor of the building, a floor that had been closed off for renovations for months. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably just some glitch in the system, I thought. But as I dug deeper, I realized there was something more going on. The activity was too consistent, too deliberate to be just a glitch. Someone was using the network on that floor, and they were doing it with purpose. I debated calling security or the police, but I knew they wouldn't be able to do much without more information. I decided to investigate on my own, to see if I could figure out who or what was behind this strange activity. I made my way up to the unused floor, my heart pounding in my chest with every step. The floor was dark and empty, with rows of dusty cubicles lining the walls. It felt like something out of a horror movie, the kind where you know something bad is about to happen. I cautiously made my way through the floor, my senses on high alert. I kept expecting someone to jump out at me from the shadows, but the floor remained eerily quiet. That is, until I reached the far end of the floor. There, hidden away in a corner, was a small group of people huddled around a cluster of computers. They were all wearing hoodies and masks, their faces hidden from view. I froze, my blood running cold as I realized what I was seeing. These weren't just random people using the network, they were hackers, and they were using the building as their base of operations. I wanted to run, to get as far away from them as I could, but I knew I couldn't. I needed to gather as much information as possible so I could report it to the authorities. I crept closer, trying to stay hidden in the shadows. I listened in on their conversation, trying to piece together what they were planning. It didn't take long to figure it out. They were talking about launching a cyber attack on a major corporation, one that would cripple their systems and leave them vulnerable to attack. I felt a surge of fear coursing through me as I realized the scale of what they were planning. If they succeeded, it could mean chaos for thousands of people, maybe even millions. I knew I had to do something, but I also knew I couldn't take them on by myself. I needed backup, someone who could help me stop them before it was too late. I quietly made my way back to the IT department, my mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. I called the police and explained the situation, telling them everything I had seen and heard. They arrived quickly, and together we made our way back up to the unused floor. But when we got there, the hackers were gone, leaving behind nothing but empty computers and discarded masks. I felt a sense of relief knowing that they were gone, but I also knew that it wasn't over yet. We still had to track them down and stop them before they could carry out their plan. In the end, we were able to stop the hackers before they could do any real damage. It was a close call, and I'll never forget the fear I felt that night, knowing that the safety of so many people was at stake. But I'm grateful that I was able to do something to help, even if it meant putting myself in danger. And I'll never forget the lesson I learned. Sometimes, the scariest threats aren't the ones you can see, but the ones hiding in the shadows, waiting to strike. I was staying at this old fishing cabin for a weekend getaway. It was supposed to be a relaxing time, just me and the sound of the rain on the roof. But then the storm hit, and everything changed. I was sitting by the fire, reading a book, when I heard it. A scream, loud and piercing, cutting through the sound of the rain. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again, closer this time. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, trying to see through the darkness and the rain. And that's when I saw her, stumbling out of the trees, her clothes torn and her face covered in dirt. She was crying and shaking, her whole body trembling with fear. I ran over to her, asking her what happened, if she was okay. She told me she had escaped from a kidnapper, that he had been holding her captive in the woods. I didn't know what to do, how to help her. I was just a regular guy, not some kind of hero. But I knew I couldn't just leave her out there in the storm, alone and terrified. So I brought her inside the cabin, trying to calm her down and make her feel safe. I gave her some dry clothes and a blanket, trying to warm her up from the cold. As she sat there, trembling and sobbing, she told me her story. She said she had been out for a walk in the woods when a man had grabbed her from behind, dragging her into his car and driving off into the night. She said she had been trapped in his cabin for days, locked away in a dark room with no way out. I felt sick to my stomach, imagining what she must have gone through. I couldn't believe that something like that could happen, not out here in the middle of nowhere. But then again, I guess you never really know what people are capable of. I wanted to call the police, to get her help right away. But then she begged me not to, saying that he would come looking for her, that he would never stop until he found her. I didn't know what to do, torn between wanting to help her and wanting to protect myself. And then, just as I was trying to figure out what to do next, I heard it. A car pulling up outside, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, as I realized that he had found her, that he was here to take her back. I grabbed the nearest weapon I could find, a fireplace poker, and stood there in the darkness, waiting for him to come inside. I didn't know if I could take him on, if I could protect her from whatever he had planned. But then the car drove off again, disappearing into the night as quickly as it had come. I let out a sigh of relief, feeling the tension drain from my body as I realized that we were safe, at least for now. I stayed up all night, keeping watch over her as she slept, afraid that he would come back. But he never did. And when morning came, I drove her into town, to the nearest police station, where she could get the help she needed. I never found out what happened to her after that, if they caught the guy or if she ever got justice for what he did to her. But I like to think that she did, that she was able to move on with her life and leave the nightmare behind her. As for me, well, I never went back to that fishing cabin again. The memories were too painful, too haunting. But I'll never forget the terror of that night, the fear of not knowing if we would make it out alive. And I'll always be grateful that we did. I was in my apartment, alone, during a citywide blackout caused by a raging storm. The darkness was suffocating, enveloping everything in its thick embrace. The only sound was the howling wind outside, rattling the windows and sending shivers down my spine. Suddenly, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone trying to break in. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in terror, not knowing what to do. Panic surged through me as I realized I was completely vulnerable in the darkness. I had to think fast, to find a way to protect myself from whoever was trying to get inside. My mind raced with fear, trying to come up with a plan, but all I could think about was the impending danger. I groped around in the darkness, searching desperately for something, anything, that I could use as a weapon. My hands closed around a heavy lamp, and I clutched it tightly, ready to defend myself if the intruder managed to break through the door. The pounding on the door grew louder and more frantic, and I could hear the sound of splintering wood as they tried to force their way in. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt like I was going to be sick with fear. But then, suddenly, the pounding stopped, and there was nothing but silence. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. It was as if the intruder had vanished into thin air. I stood there in the darkness, trembling with fear, unsure of what to do next. Should I call the police? Should I try to find a way out of the apartment? I didn't know, and the uncertainty only made my fear worse. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the pounding started again, louder and more ferocious than before. My blood ran cold as I realized that whatever was on the other side of that door was not going to give up easily. I backed away from the door, clutching the lamp tightly in my trembling hands. I felt like a cornered animal, trapped and helpless in the face of impending danger. But then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I heard the sound of voices outside. Relief flooded through me as I realized that help had finally arrived. The police had come to rescue me from whatever nightmare I had found myself in. I rushed to the door, throwing it open and stumbling out into the hallway. The police were there, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like beacons of hope. They quickly subdued the intruder, leading them away in handcuffs. I stood there in the hallway, shaking with relief, grateful to be alive. It was over, the nightmare was finally over, and I was safe once again. But the memory of that night would stay with me forever, a constant reminder of the terrifying darkness that lurks just beyond the edges of our everyday lives. It was a typical night shift at the psychiatric hospital, and I was going about my duties as usual. The hospital was quiet, patients were mostly asleep, and everything seemed normal. But then, I heard it, a strange, eerie noise coming from one of the closed-off wings of the hospital. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just the building settling or the wind blowing outside. But the noise persisted, growing louder and more unsettling with each passing moment. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, sending shivers down my spine. Curiosity got the better of me, and I knew I had to investigate. I made my way down the dimly lit hallway, the sound growing louder with each step I took. As I reached the closed-off wing, I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what I would find on the other side. But I couldn't let fear hold me back, so I pushed open the door and stepped inside. What I saw inside the wing sent chills down my spine. There, huddled in the corner of the room, was a former patient, someone who had been discharged months ago. I couldn't believe my eyes. How had this patient managed to sneak back into the hospital unnoticed? And why were they hiding out in this closed-off wing? But as I approached, I realized something was terribly wrong. The patient was muttering to themselves, their eyes wild with fear and paranoia. They were dangerously delusional, lost in a world of their own making. I knew I had to act fast. I couldn't let this patient harm themselves or anyone else. But I also knew that approaching them could be dangerous. They were unpredictable, and I had no way of knowing how they would react. With a deep breath, I slowly approached the patient, keeping my movements calm and steady. I tried to reassure them that everything was going to be okay, but they didn't seem to hear me. Suddenly, the patient lunged at me, their hands reaching out with surprising strength. I barely had time to react, dodging out of the way just in time to avoid their grasp. My heart was pounding in my chest as I backed away, trying to think of what to do next. I knew I needed to get help, but the hospital was deserted at this time of night, and I was on my own. But then, I remembered the emergency call button on my radio. With shaking hands, I pressed the button and called for backup, hoping that someone would hear my call and come to my aid. Seconds felt like hours as I waited for help to arrive. I could hear the patient behind me, still muttering to themselves and growing more agitated by the second. Finally, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching, and relief flooded through me as two security guards burst into the room. Together, we were able to restrain the patient and get them the help they so desperately needed. As the patient was taken away by medical staff, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude wash over me. I had faced danger head-on and come out the other side unscathed. But as I made my way back to my station, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air. This encounter had been a stark reminder of the dangers that lurked within the walls of the psychiatric hospital, dangers that I would never forget. Working late shifts at the library is pretty common for me. I'm used to the quiet, the musty smell of old books, and the occasional creaks and groans of the building settling. But one night, things got a whole lot weirder. I was down in the basement, sorting through some old archives, when I heard a noise coming from the far corner of the room. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again, a soft shuffling sound, like someone moving around. I called out, thinking maybe it was just one of the other librarians working late, but there was no response. I felt a knot of unease forming in my stomach as I cautiously made my way over to where the noise was coming from. As I got closer, I could see a small pile of blankets and pillows tucked away in a corner, hidden from view. My heart started pounding as I realized what it meant. Someone had been living down here in the basement, right under our noses. I called out again, louder this time, but still, there was no response. I felt a surge of fear coursing through me as I realized that whoever it was might still be down here, hiding in the shadows, watching me. I wanted to run, to get out of there as fast as I could, but I knew I had to stay calm. I couldn't risk alerting whoever it was to my presence. I took a deep breath and tried to think of what to do next. I considered calling the police, but I didn't want to leave the safety of the basement until I knew for sure that whoever it was had left. I decided to search the rest of the room first, to make sure I was alone. I crept around the basement, my heart pounding in my chest with every step. I checked behind bookshelves, under tables, and even in the darkest corners, but there was no sign of anyone else. Just when I was starting to think maybe I had imagined the whole thing, I heard it again, that soft shuffling sound, coming from right behind me. I froze, my blood running cold as I slowly turned around to face whatever was there. But there was nothing. No one. Just an empty room, filled with rows and rows of dusty old books. I felt a surge of relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. Because then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere deep within the shadows. My blood turned to ice as I realized that I wasn't alone down here in the basement after all. I didn't stick around to find out what was making that noise. I turned and ran, faster than I ever had in my life, up the stairs and out of the basement. I didn't stop until I was safely outside, gasping for breath in the cool night air. I called the police and told them what had happened, but by the time they arrived, the basement was empty. There was no sign of anyone living down there, no trace of the person who had been trapped in the building with me. I tried to go back to work after that, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the building, every shadow in the corner of my eye, made my skin crawl. I don't know who or what was down there in the basement with me that night, but I know one thing for sure: I'll never forget the terror I felt when I realized I wasn't alone. And I'll never go back down there again. I was a journalist, sent to investigate reports of a missing person in a remote town. The town was tucked away in the mountains, far from the hustle and bustle of civilization. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or so I thought. As I arrived in town, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The streets were deserted, and the few people I did see seemed wary of outsiders. I tried to ask around about the missing person, but no one seemed willing to talk. They just gave me these blank stares, like they didn't want to get involved. I knew I had to dig deeper to uncover the truth behind the disappearance. So, I started poking around, asking questions and snooping around where I wasn't supposed to. That's when I stumbled upon it. A hidden community, tucked away in the mountains, living off the grid and off the radar of the outside world. At first, I thought maybe they were just a group of survivalists or doomsday preppers, trying to escape the chaos of the modern world. But the more I learned about them, the more I realized that there was something darker at play. They had their own rules, their own way of doing things. And anyone who tried to leave or speak out against them was dealt with swiftly and mercilessly. I knew I was treading on dangerous ground, but I couldn't turn back now. I had to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. As I delved deeper into the community, I uncovered evidence of unspeakable horrors. Abuse, corruption, and even murder were all part of their everyday lives. I tried to document everything, to gather enough evidence to bring them to justice. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized that I was in way over my head. I started to feel like I was being watched, like there were eyes on me from every direction. I knew I had to get out of there before it was too late. But as I tried to leave town, I realized that they weren't going to let me go that easily. They knew what I was up to, and they weren't about to let me expose their dark secrets to the world. I tried to run, to escape into the mountains and disappear before they could catch me. But they were one step ahead of me, closing in from all sides. I felt like a trapped animal, with nowhere to run and no one to turn to for help. I knew I had to think fast if I wanted to survive. I managed to slip away into the woods, hiding out in a remote cabin until I could come up with a plan. But even there, I wasn't safe. They found me, cornering me in the woods and dragging me back to town. I fought back with everything I had, but it was no use. They were too strong, too determined to see their dark secrets remain hidden. I thought I was done for, that I would never make it out of that town alive. But just when it seemed like all hope was lost, help arrived. The authorities had been tipped off about what was going on in the town, and they swooped in to rescue me before it was too late. As I was led away from that nightmare town, I couldn't help but feel grateful to be alive. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next unsuspecting victim. I'm a survivalist, someone who thrives on the challenge of the great outdoors. So when I decided to embark on a solo camping trip deep in the wilderness, I knew I was in for an adventure. But as I set up camp in a secluded clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The forest seemed eerily quiet, as if the very trees were holding their breath in anticipation of something sinister. And then, just as I was settling in for the night, I heard the sound of voices echoing through the trees, low and guttural, like the growls of wild animals. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was now alone in the wilderness. With my heart pounding in my chest, I crouched down low and listened intently, trying to make out what the voices were saying. But their words were muffled and indistinct, carried away on the wind before I could decipher them. I knew I had to act fast if I wanted to avoid detection. With trembling hands, I doused the fire and packed up my gear, moving silently through the trees like a shadow in the night. But just when I thought I had escaped the poacher's notice, I stumbled upon their camp hidden deep in the forest. My blood ran cold as I caught sight of them, a group of men armed to the teeth with rifles and machetes, their faces obscured by the darkness. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was outnumbered and outgunned. I knew I had to find a way to evade capture and make it out of the forest alive. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I ducked behind a tree and waited for the perfect moment to make my move. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of fear through me as I waited for the poachers to pass by. And then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I caught sight of something moving in the darkness, something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. It was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen before, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light as it prowled through the trees. Panic surged through me as I realized that the poachers were not just hunting animals, they were hunting something far more dangerous. And I knew that if they caught sight of me, I would be next on their list. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed myself to my feet and raced through the forest, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the trees as I fled for my life. But the creature was hot on my trail, its growls echoing through the darkness like a death knell. And then, just when I thought I couldn't run any longer, I stumbled upon a narrow ravine hidden deep in the heart of the forest. With no other options left, I leaped into the darkness and prayed that I would survive the fall. Miraculously, I landed safely at the bottom of the ravine, my body battered and bruised but still alive. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening intently for any sign of danger. But the forest was eerily silent, as if the very trees were holding their breath in anticipation of what was to come. With trembling hands, I pushed myself to my feet and began to make my way out of the ravine and back to safety. And then, finally, I emerged from the darkness of the forest and into the light of day. Relief flooded through me as I realized that I had escaped the clutches of the poachers and the creature that hunted in their midst. I'm a mountaineer, always seeking the next challenge in my quest to conquer the tallest peaks. One day, I found myself scaling a treacherous peak, the wind whipping around me as I fought my way up the steep incline. But just when I thought I had reached the summit, a sudden blizzard descended upon the mountain, engulfing me in a swirling mass of snow and ice. I struggled to find my way through the whiteout conditions, the biting cold gnawing in my bones as I searched for shelter. With each step, the snow grew deeper and the wind stronger, threatening to sweep me off the mountain and into the abyss below. But I refused to give up, determined to find a way to survive the storm. And then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I stumbled upon a group of stranded climbers huddled together in the snow. Relief flooded through me as I realized that I wasn't alone in the storm. But as I approached, a sense of unease settled over me. There was something strange about the way they looked at me, their eyes cold and calculating as they assessed me from head to toe. Panic surged through me as I realized that they were not here to offer me shelter. They were here to take advantage of my vulnerability. I knew I had to find a way to escape before it was too late. With trembling hands, I searched for a way out, but the blizzard raged on around me, obscuring my vision and disorienting me in the whiteout conditions. I could feel the weight of their gaze bearing down on me, as if they were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But just as I thought things couldn't get any worse, one of the climbers lunged forward and grabbed me by the arm, his grip like a vice around my wrist. Panic surged through me as I struggled to break free, but he was too strong, his fingers digging into my flesh like talons. With every ounce of strength I had left, I fought against him, kicking and thrashing as I tried to break free from his grasp. But he held on tight, his grip unyielding as he dragged me towards the edge of the cliff. Desperation surged through me as I realized that he intended to throw me off the mountain and into the abyss below. I knew I had to find a way to escape, to outsmart him and find a way to survive the deadly game he was playing. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I summoned every ounce of strength I had left and managed to break free from his grasp. And then, with a burst of speed, I raced away from the edge of the cliff and into the safety of the storm. But even as I fled, I knew that I couldn't outrun them forever. I needed to find a way to outsmart them, to use my knowledge of the mountain to my advantage. With every step, I searched for a way out, my senses on high alert as I navigated the treacherous terrain. Every gust of wind, every crack of thunder, sent a jolt of fear through me as I raced against time to escape the clutches of the stranded climbers with sinister intentions. And then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I caught sight of a narrow passageway up ahead, a glimmer of light shining through the darkness like a beacon of hope. With renewed determination, I pushed myself towards it, ignoring the pain and exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm me. And then, finally, I burst through the surface and into the open air, gasping for breath as I emerged from the depths of the blizzard. I collapsed onto the snow-covered ground, exhausted and shaken, but alive. I had escaped the clutches of the stranded climbers with sinister intentions, but the memory of that terrifying encounter would haunt me for the rest of my days. It was a stark reminder of the dangers that lurk in the unforgiving wilderness, waiting to ensnare those who dare to venture too close. It was a regular night, just me and the flickering glow of the TV in my small townhouse. I'm a cop, so I've seen my fair share of creepy stuff, but nothing could have prepared me for what was about to happen. I was just about to settle into bed when the police scanner on my nightstand crackled to life. There was a report of a break-in at my address. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed my gun and badge, rushing out the door without a second thought. The drive home felt like an eternity. Every second that passed, my mind raced with possibilities. Who could be breaking into my house? Did they know I was a cop? Were they armed? When I finally pulled up to my townhouse, adrenaline coursing through my veins, I saw that the front door was wide open. I approached cautiously, gun drawn, ready for anything. Inside, the house was dark and quiet. I called out, but there was no response. My heart sank as I realized the intruder could still be here, hiding in the shadows. I flicked on the lights, illuminating the living room. That's when I saw him, a figure standing in the corner, shrouded in darkness. He was wearing a ski mask, his eyes gleaming with malice. Without hesitation, I ordered him to freeze, but he didn't move. Instead, he started to laugh, a chilling sound that sent shivers down my spine. I demanded to know who he was and what he wanted, but he just kept laughing. It was like he was toying with me, enjoying my fear. As I edged closer, gun steady in my hand, the intruder suddenly lunged at me. We grappled on the floor, fighting for control. Adrenaline surged through me as I struggled to overpower him. In the midst of the chaos, I managed to get a good look at his face, and that's when I realized the truth. The intruder wasn't a stranger. He was someone I knew, someone from my past. His eyes bore into mine with a mixture of hatred and madness. He whispered my name, his voice dripping with venom. I couldn't believe it. How had he found me? How had he gotten into my house? The questions swirled in my mind as we continued to struggle. But even as fear threatened to consume me, I refused to give up. With a surge of strength, I managed to pin him down, holding him until backup arrived. When the other officers burst through the door, they found me kneeling on the floor, breathing heavily, my hands still clenched around the intruder's wrists. It was over. The nightmare was finally over. But as I looked into the eyes of the man who had tried to break me, I knew that the terror would linger long after the scars had healed. I recently graduated from college and moved into a new apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It was a cozy place, perfect for starting my new life as a young professional. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, and I felt safe and comfortable in my new surroundings. One night, I was home alone, enjoying some peace and quiet after a long day at work. I was just settling down on the couch with a book when I heard a knock on the door. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated for a moment before getting up to answer it. Standing on the other side of the door was my neighbor, a middle-aged man who lived in the apartment next to mine. He looked disheveled and out of breath, like he had been running. He claimed that he needed help, that there was an emergency in his apartment and he didn't know what to do. He seemed genuinely distressed, and I felt sorry for him. Without thinking, I invited him inside, eager to lend a helping hand. But as soon as he stepped through the doorway, I knew that something was wrong. There was something off about his demeanor, something unsettling in the way he looked at me. It was like he was sizing me up, like he was trying to figure out if I was a threat. I tried to brush off the feeling of unease and led him into the living room, asking him what was wrong. But instead of answering, he just stood there, staring at me with a strange intensity. I felt a knot form in the pit of my stomach as I realized that I had made a mistake. This man wasn't here for help, he was here for something else entirely. But before I could react, he lunged at me, his hands reaching out to grab me. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to put some distance between us. But he was relentless, pursuing me through the apartment with a look of madness in his eyes. I knew that I needed to get out of there, to escape before it was too late. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I made a break for the door, praying that I could make it to safety. But just as I reached for the doorknob, he grabbed me from behind, his grip like iron around my arms. I struggled and fought, desperate to break free, but he was too strong. In a last-ditch effort to escape, I kicked out blindly, connecting with something solid. There was a grunt of pain, and his grip loosened just enough for me to slip away. I raced out of the apartment, my heart pounding in my ears as I ran down the hallway and out into the night. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the street, where I collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath. I knew that I needed to call the police, to report what had happened and make sure that this man was brought to justice. But for now, all I could do was catch my breath and try to process the horror of what had just occurred. As I sat there on the sidewalk, shaking with fear and adrenaline, I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't managed to escape. What was this man's motive, and why had he targeted me? But those questions would have to wait for another time. For now, all that mattered was that I was safe, that I had managed to get away from him before it was too late. It was just another night on the job, cleaning up after everyone had gone home. I've been working as a janitor at this office building for years, and I thought I had seen it all. But lately, things have been getting weird. I started noticing that the same few offices on the upper floors were always unlocked when I came in for my shift. It struck me as odd because they were supposed to be empty after hours. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe some forgetful employee had left their office unlocked by mistake. But as the nights went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One night, I decided to investigate. I made my way up to the floor where the unlocked offices were located, my curiosity getting the better of me. As I walked down the dimly lit hallway, I noticed that one of the doors was slightly ajar. My heart began to race as I approached, my hand trembling as I pushed the door open. To my horror, I found someone inside, huddled in the corner of the office. It was a man, his eyes wide with fear as he stared back at me. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen in place, my mind racing with a million thoughts. Who was this man? How long had he been living here? And most importantly, why was he hiding out in an empty office? I could see the fear in his eyes, and it broke my heart. I knew I had to help him, but I also knew that I couldn't do it alone. I quickly made my way back to the security office and called the police. I explained the situation to them, and they assured me that they would send someone over right away. As I waited for the police to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that washed over me. What if the man was dangerous? What if he had hurt someone? But I pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the task at hand. I had to stay calm and keep the man safe until help arrived. When the police finally arrived, they took the man into custody and questioned him about why he was living in the office. It turns out he had fallen on hard times and had nowhere else to go. I felt a wave of sympathy for him as I listened to his story. No one should have to resort to living in an empty office just to survive. But despite everything, I was relieved that the situation had been resolved peacefully. The man was taken to a shelter, where he would receive the help and support he needed to get back on his feet. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered long after the man had been taken away. It was a stark reminder of the dangers that lurked in the darkness, even in a seemingly safe place like an office building. But I refused to let fear consume me. I had faced my fears head-on and come out the other side stronger for it. And as I finished my shift and headed home for the night, I knew that I would never look at the office building the same way again. I was out on patrol in the national park, just like any other night. My job as a park ranger was to ensure the safety of the park and its wildlife, but that night, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. As I made my way through the dense forest, I heard the sound of voices up ahead. At first, I thought it might be campers who had stayed out too late, but as I got closer, I realized that something wasn't right. There, in a clearing up ahead, I saw a group of men huddled around a fire. They were armed and dangerous, and it was clear that they weren't there to enjoy the beauty of nature. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized what was happening. These men were poachers, and they were hunting the animals in the park for profit. I knew I had to do something, but I also knew that confronting them could be dangerous. These men were armed, and I was just one person. But I couldn't just stand by and do nothing while they destroyed the park and killed innocent animals. I had to act, and I had to act fast. I crouched down behind a bush, trying to come up with a plan. I knew I couldn't take them on by myself, but I also knew that I had to do something to stop them. As I watched them from my hiding spot, I saw one of the men raise his rifle and take aim at a nearby deer. My heart sank as I realized that they were about to kill one of the park's majestic creatures. Without thinking, I sprang into action. I burst out from my hiding spot and shouted at the men to stop what they were doing. They turned to look at me, surprise and anger written on their faces. But before they could react, I pulled out my radio and called for backup. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air as park rangers descended upon the clearing. The poachers realized that they were outnumbered and outgunned, and they quickly surrendered without a fight. As the rangers took the poachers into custody, I breathed a sigh of relief. The animals in the park were safe, and the poachers would be brought to justice for their crimes. But as I made my way back to the ranger station, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the back of my mind. I had come face to face with danger that night, and it was a terrifying experience that I would never forget. I was working the night shift at the shopping mall, just like any other night. My job was to clean up the place after it had closed, making sure everything was spick and span for the next day. But that night was different. As I made my rounds through the mall, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was quiet, too quiet, and there was a strange tension in the air. I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me and continued with my work. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to see what it was. There, in the darkness of one of the stores, I saw shadowy figures moving about. My blood ran cold as I realized what was happening. There were people in the mall, and they weren't supposed to be there. I knew I should call the police, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding before me. The figures were moving with purpose, their movements quick and deliberate. It didn't take long for me to realize what was going on. These people were burglars, and they were planning a heist. I knew I had to do something, but fear held me rooted to the spot. I watched helplessly as they moved from store to store, gathering up merchandise and stuffing it into bags. But then, just as they were about to leave, one of them spotted me. I felt a surge of panic as our eyes met, knowing that I had been caught. Without thinking, I turned and ran, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty mall. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps pounding on the tile floor as they gave chase. I ducked into a nearby store, hoping to hide from them until the police arrived. But they were hot on my heels, and before I knew it, they had caught up to me. I tried to fight them off, but there were too many of them, and they quickly overpowered me. I felt a sharp blow to the head, and everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of the mall, my head throbbing with pain. I could hear sirens in the distance, getting closer and closer with each passing moment. I knew I had to get up and get out of there before the burglars returned. With a groan, I forced myself to my feet and stumbled towards the exit. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I saw the flashing lights of police cars pulling up outside the mall. Relief flooded through me as I realized that help had finally arrived. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted and shaken by my ordeal. But I was alive, and that was all that mattered. The police quickly apprehended the burglars, and the stolen merchandise was returned to its rightful owners. As for me, I was hailed as a hero for helping to stop the heist. But as I lay in my bed that night, my body bruised and sore from the encounter, I couldn't shake the feeling of fear that lingered in the back of my mind. I had come face to face with danger that night, and it was a terrifying experience that I would never forget. Working the night shift at the pharmacy was usually pretty quiet. I spent most of my time stocking shelves, filling prescriptions, and keeping an eye on things. But lately, things had been getting a little weird. I had been noticing that certain medications were going missing: painkillers, sleeping pills, stuff like that. At first, I thought maybe I had miscounted or misplaced them, but it kept happening, night after night. I started to get suspicious, wondering if someone was stealing the meds. But I couldn't figure out how they were doing it. The pharmacy was locked up tight at night, and there were security cameras everywhere. One night, I decided to stay late and try to catch whoever was behind it. I hid in the back room, waiting and watching for any sign of movement. Sure enough, around midnight, I heard a noise coming from the front of the store. I crept out of the back room, my heart pounding in my chest as I approached the front counter. There, standing behind the counter, was a man I had never seen before. He was rummaging through the shelves, grabbing bottles of pills and stuffing them into his pockets. I felt a surge of anger coursing through me as I realized what was happening. This guy was the one stealing the medications, and he had been doing it right under my nose the whole time. I knew I should have called the police right then and there, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the adrenaline pumping through my veins, or maybe it was just sheer stupidity, but I decided to confront him instead. I stepped out from behind the counter, my hands trembling with fear and anger. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty store. "What do you think you're doing?" The man spun around, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw me standing there. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us sure what to do next. Then, without warning, he lunged at me, his fists flying. I barely had time to react, ducking out of the way just in time to avoid his blows. We grappled with each other, stumbling around the store in a frantic dance of violence. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins, dulling the pain of each blow as we fought. But I knew I couldn't keep it up forever. The man was bigger and stronger than me, and it was only a matter of time before he overpowered me. I needed to end this, and fast. With a surge of determination, I managed to land a solid punch to his jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground. I didn't stick around to see if he was okay. I grabbed my phone and called the police, telling them everything that had happened. They arrived quickly, and together we were able to apprehend the man and take him into custody. It turned out he had been stealing the medications to sell on the black market, a desperate attempt to make some quick cash. In the end, I was hailed as a hero for stopping him. But as I lay in bed that night, my body bruised and sore from the fight, I couldn't shake the feeling of fear that lingered in the back of my mind. I had come face to face with danger that night, and I had survived. But I knew that not everyone was so lucky, and that the world could be a much scarier place than I had ever imagined. I'm a retired soldier, been through my fair share of battles. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on that road trip through the Appalachian Mountains. I was on a mission, you could say. A mission to confront my past, to come to terms with the things I'd seen and done during my time in the military. But as I drove deeper into the mountains, I started to feel like I was being watched. Like there were eyes on me from every direction. I tried to shake off the feeling and focus on the road ahead, but it just kept getting stronger. And then, out of nowhere, I stumbled upon a group of people camped out in the woods. At first, I thought they were just hikers or something. But as I got closer, I could see that they were armed to the teeth and wearing some kind of uniform. I should have turned around and hightailed it out of there right then and there. But something inside me told me to stay and find out what was going on. So I parked my car and approached them cautiously, trying to keep my guard up despite the sinking feeling in my gut. They didn't seem hostile at first, just a bunch of guys talking about survival tactics and preparing for the end of the world. But the longer I stayed, the more I started to realize that something wasn't right. There was this tension in the air, like they were all waiting for something to happen. And then, one of them pulled me aside and whispered something about a game they liked to play. I didn't know what he was talking about at first, but then he started going on about how they liked to hunt people for sport. How they were waiting for the perfect prey to come along. I tried to play it cool and act like I was interested, but inside I was freaking out. I knew I had to get out of there before they realized who I really was. So I made up some excuse about needing to get back on the road and said my goodbyes. But as I turned to leave, I could feel their eyes boring into my back. I made it back to my car and peeled out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away from the creepy campsite. I tried to put it out of my mind and focus on my original mission, but I couldn't shake the feeling that those survivalists were still out there, waiting for their next victim. I kept driving, pushing deeper into the mountains in search of answers. But everywhere I went, it felt like they were one step ahead of me. I started to feel like I was losing my mind, like I was trapped in some kind of twisted nightmare. But I refused to give up, refused to let those psychos get the best of me. And then, just when I was starting to lose hope, I stumbled upon a group of park rangers out on patrol. I told them everything about the survivalists and their sick game. They didn't waste any time launching an investigation, and before I knew it, they had rounded up the whole group and put them behind bars. I breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that I had done my part to put an end to their reign of terror. The drive up to the mountains was long and winding, the road sneaking through the rugged landscape like a ribbon of asphalt. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, eager to reconnect with my daughter after years of estrangement. But as I pulled up to her cabin, nestled deep in the heart of the Colorado wilderness, a sense of unease settled over me like a heavy fog. Parking the car, I stepped out onto the gravel driveway and surveyed my surroundings. The cabin looked deserted, its windows dark and empty. I called out for my daughter, but there was no response, only the distant sound of the wind whispering through the trees. My heart pounding in my chest, I approached the front door and tried the handle, but it was locked tight. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I pulled out my spare key and let myself in, the door creaking ominously on its hinges as I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was eerily silent, the air thick with the scent of pine and something else, something metallic and acrid. I called out for my daughter again, but there was still no answer, only the sound of my own voice echoing off the walls. I searched every room, every nook and cranny, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but an empty shell of a home. Panic rising in my chest, I rushed outside and scanned the surrounding forest, hoping against hope that she had simply gone for a walk and gotten lost. But there was no sign of her, no trace of her presence anywhere. Fighting back a sense of despair, I resolved to search the area myself, to leave no stone unturned until I found her. I grabbed a flashlight and a jacket and set off into the wilderness, the darkness closing in around me like a suffocating blanket. For hours, I trudged through the woods, my heart pounding in my ears with every step. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my feet and the distant howl of a wolf echoing through the night. And then, just when I was beginning to lose hope, I saw it, a faint glimmer of light in the distance. I quickened my pace, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I stumbled toward the source. As I drew closer, I could make out the outline of a small clearing, illuminated by the soft glow of a campfire. And there, sitting by the fire, was my daughter. Relief flooded through me as I rushed forward and enveloped her in a tight embrace. She looked up at me with tear-stained eyes, and I knew that whatever had happened, we would get through it together. But as we sat by the fire, warming ourselves against the chill of the night, my daughter began to tell me her story, and I felt a chill run down my spine. She had been out for a walk earlier that evening when she stumbled upon a group of strange men lurking in the woods. They had chased her through the trees, their eyes filled with malice, until she had finally managed to lose them and find her way back to the cabin. As she spoke, I felt a cold knot of fear form in the pit of my stomach. Who were these men, and what did they want with my daughter? I knew that we had to get out of there, to leave this place far behind us before it was too late. Gathering our belongings, we made our way back to the cabin and packed up the car, our movements frantic and desperate. As we drove away from that isolated cabin in the mountains, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that those men were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next victim. But we made it out safe, my daughter and I, and as we drove down the winding mountain roads, I vowed never to return to that cursed place again. For in those remote mountains of Colorado, there are secrets best left undisturbed, and dangers lurking in the darkness that are better off forgotten. It was another late night at the office, and I found myself once again working alone in my apartment, surrounded by the glow of my computer screen. The deadlines were looming, and I was determined to finish the project before calling it a night. As I typed away at my keyboard, lost in my work, I suddenly heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps coming from the hallway outside my door. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but as the footsteps grew louder, I knew that I couldn't ignore them any longer. With trembling hands, I got up from my desk and made my way to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob, before finally mustering the courage to open it. But when I stepped into the hallway, there was no one there. I peered into the darkness, my eyes straining to see anything out of the ordinary, but there was nothing. Just the empty hallway, bathed in the soft glow of the overhead lights. I closed the door behind me, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me. Maybe it was just a neighbor coming home late, or the sound of the wind rattling the windows. I tried to convince myself that there was a rational explanation for the footsteps, but deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. I returned to my desk, trying to focus on my work, but the footsteps continued, growing louder and more insistent with each passing minute. It was as if they were following me, stalking me through the darkness of the night. I tried to drown out the noise with music, turning up the volume on my headphones until it was almost deafening. But no matter how loud I played it, the footsteps persisted, echoing through the empty apartment like a sinister drumbeat. I couldn't take it anymore. With a sense of dread knotting in my stomach, I made my way back to the door, determined to confront whatever was lurking in the hallway outside. But when I opened the door again, there was still no one there. I called out into the darkness, my voice echoing off the walls, but there was no response. It was as if I was completely alone in the building, with no one to hear my cries for help. I slammed the door shut, feeling a wave of panic wash over me. Was I losing my mind? Was this some kind of elaborate prank? Or was there really someone out there, watching me from the shadows? I tried to rationalize the situation, telling myself that it was just my imagination getting the better of me. But deep down, I knew that there was something more sinister at play. The footsteps continued throughout the night, growing louder and more menacing with each passing hour. I tried to block them out, burying myself in my work and trying to pretend like everything was normal. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone or something was lurking just beyond the walls of my apartment, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That I was hearing footsteps in the hallway? That I thought someone was out to get me? They would never believe me. I was on my own, trapped in a nightmare of my own making. And as the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, I knew that I had to do something before it was too late. With a sense of determination, I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and made my way back to the door. I didn't know what I would find on the other side, but I knew that I couldn't stay cooped up in my apartment any longer. As I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, the footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that sent shivers down my spine. I shone the flashlight down the corridor, illuminating the empty space with its harsh beam. And that's when I saw it, a shadowy figure lurking just beyond the reach of the light. It was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I froze in terror, my heart pounding in my chest as I stared back at the figure. And then, without warning, it vanished into thin air, leaving me alone in the darkness once again. I stumbled back into my apartment, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it tight. I didn't sleep a wink that night, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had seen and heard. But when morning finally came, the footsteps were gone, replaced by the sounds of the city coming to life outside my window. I tried to convince myself that it had all been a dream, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and stress. But deep down, I knew the truth. The footsteps were real, and so was the figure that had stalked me through the night. I was out hiking solo in the wilderness, surrounded by towering trees and the sounds of nature. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I'd been walking for hours, enjoying the solitude and the beauty of the wilderness. As I trudged along the narrow trail, my eyes caught sight of something in the distance, an old, abandoned cabin nestled among the trees. It looked like it had been there for years, forgotten by time. Curiosity piqued, I veered off the trail and made my way towards it. The cabin was weather-beaten and run down, but there was something strangely alluring about it. I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. The interior was dark and musty, with dust motes dancing in the faint light filtering through the windows. It was clear that no one had lived here for a long time. I shivered, suddenly feeling a chill in the air. Despite the eerie atmosphere, I couldn't resist exploring further. I wandered through the rooms, running my fingers along the peeling wallpaper and cobweb-covered furniture. It was like stepping back in time. As I made my way to the back of the cabin, I stumbled upon a trapdoor hidden beneath a threadbare rug. My heart skipped a beat as I lifted the rug and peered into the darkness below. With a shaky breath, I descended into the cellar, the wooden steps creaking beneath my feet. The air was thick and musty, and a sense of unease settled over me like a heavy blanket. The cellar was small and cramped, with shelves lining the walls, filled with jars of preserved food and dusty old books. But as I scanned the room, my eyes landed on something that made my blood run cold, a makeshift altar, adorned with candles and strange symbols. My heart raced as I realized that I wasn't alone. Someone had been here, someone who practiced dark rituals in this remote cabin in the woods. Panic surged through me as I turned to leave, but before I could reach the stairs, I heard a sound behind me, a low, guttural growl that froze me in place. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw him, a man emerging from the shadows, his eyes wild with madness. I stumbled backward, my mind racing with fear. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips as he advanced towards me, a sinister smile playing on his lips. I knew I had to get out of there, to escape before it was too late. With every ounce of strength I had left, I turned and bolted up the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears. I burst through the door and into the fading light of the setting sun, sprinting through the forest as fast as my legs could carry me. Branches clawed at my skin, and roots threatened to trip me up, but I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the trail. I didn't dare look back as I ran, the terror fueling my every step. It felt like hours before I finally emerged from the trees, gasping for breath and covered in sweat. But even as I collapsed on the ground, my heart still pounding with fear, I knew that I had escaped. I had survived the horror that lurked in the depths of the forest, and I would never forget the terror of that abandoned cabin in the woods. It was another late-night shift at the restaurant. I was tasked with cleaning up the mess left behind by the diners and the staff. The place was usually quiet at this time of night, with only the hum of the kitchen appliances and the occasional clatter of dishes to keep me company. But that night was different. As I was wiping down the tables in the dining area, I heard a faint noise coming from the kitchen. At first, I brushed it off as the sound of the dishwasher or the refrigerator kicking in. But then I heard it again, a low, muffled sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether I should investigate or ignore it and carry on with my work. But curiosity got the better of me, and I made my way towards the kitchen to see what was going on. As I stepped inside, I was greeted by darkness, the only light coming from the glow of the overhead lamps. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but there was no response. I took a few cautious steps forward, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained my ears to listen for any sign of movement. That's when I saw him, a figure lurking in the shadows near the back of the kitchen. It took me a moment to recognize him, but when I did, my blood ran cold. It was a former employee, someone who had been fired months ago for stealing from the restaurant. He had always been a bit unstable, but I never thought he would do something like this. I tried to reason with him, telling him to leave before things got out of hand. But he just laughed, a cold, menacing sound that sent a chill down my spine. He started to advance towards me, his eyes glinting with malice as he brandished a knife in his hand. I knew I had to get out of there, but I was frozen in place, my legs refusing to move. I backed away slowly, trying to keep him in my line of sight as I searched for a way to escape. But he was relentless, closing in on me with each step until I was backed up against the wall, with nowhere left to run. I could feel the panic rising inside me as I stared into his eyes, the glint of madness reflecting back at me. I knew I was in serious trouble, and I had to think fast if I wanted to survive. Desperate, I reached out and grabbed the nearest object, a heavy cast iron skillet, and swung it at him with all my strength. It connected with his head with a sickening thud, and he stumbled backwards, dropping the knife as he fell to the ground. I didn't waste any time. I turned and ran as fast as I could, out of the kitchen and towards the front door of the restaurant. I didn't stop until I was safely outside, the cool night air washing over me as I gasped for breath. I called the police as soon as I could, reporting what had happened and giving them a description of the intruder. They arrived on the scene quickly, and I watched from a safe distance as they apprehended him and took him into custody. It was a terrifying ordeal, one that I wouldn't wish on anyone. But I was lucky. I made it out alive, and that's all that mattered.